What if the most unlikely event in human history was not the rise of civilization or the invention of language, but the simple fact that any human being survived long enough to be here at all? For most of Earth's history, creatures like us were fragile, slow, badly equipped animals living among stronger predators, unstable climates, disease, hunger, and repeated environmental collapse. More than once, the number of humans may have fallen so low that extinction came uncomfortably close. Entire human species disappeared forever. Even our own ancestors often survived by margins so thin that a few colder winters, a slightly drier climate, or one failed generation could have erased every future city, memory, religion, and name before any of it began. If existence depended on so many accidents, then why are we the ones still here to remember any of it at all? Long before humans built cities, crossed oceans, or looked up at the stars wondering where they came from, our ancestors survived as one of the physically weakest large animals in their environment. A human being has no natural armor. Human skin tears easily. Human teeth are small compared to those of most predators. Human muscles are modest for our body size. Even today, an ordinary chimpanzee is dramatically stronger than an adult human despite being smaller. Early humans could not outrun fast animals across short distances. They could not climb as efficiently as many primates. They could not smell danger from far away like wolves or deer. In darkness, human eyesight becomes poor very quickly. At night, the world belonged to other creatures: lions, hyenas, giant cats, crocodiles, snakes, and packs of hunting animals evolved specifically for environments that humans entered almost defenseless. The strange part of human history is not that many early humans died. The strange part is that enough of them remained alive to continue at all. For millions of years, survival was not stable. A broken leg could mean death. A deep cut could become fatal, without infection ever being understood. Losing access to water for only a short period could erase an entire small group. Unlike many animals, humans also sleep deeply and for long stretches, leaving the body vulnerable for nearly a third of its existence. Early humans likely survived many nights not because they were powerful, but because they were cautious, social, and constantly aware of danger around them. Even the shape of the human body suggests compromise rather than dominance. Walking upright freed the hands, but it also slowed acceleration and exposed soft organs. The human spine, adapted gradually over evolutionary time, still carries signs that it was never perfectly redesigned for upright movement. Back pain remains one of the most common physical problems in modern humans, partly because evolution works through modification, not perfect engineering. Our ancestors inherited bodies that were functional enough to survive, but not bodies designed for safety or comfort. Human infants made survival even harder. Compared with many mammals, human babies are unusually helpless for a very long time. A newborn horse can stand within hours. A newborn human cannot even hold up its own head. This meant that early human groups carried enormous biological burdens. Adults had to protect children for years before those children became useful contributors to survival. Food had to be shared. Injured individuals sometimes needed support instead of abandonment. In harsh climates, this created a dangerous equation. The species depended on cooperation because individual humans alone were often too fragile to endure the environment surrounding them. Scientists studying hunter-gatherer societies and fossil evidence believe that social bonds were not simply emotional additions to human life. They may have been survival mechanisms as essential as food itself. Isolation for an early human could quickly become fatal. Many predators hunt isolated individuals because separation weakens awareness and defense. Humans likely understood this danger long before language fully developed. Staying close to others increased the chance that someone would notice danger first, remember a water source, or remain awake while others slept. In this way, the survival of humans may have depended less on strength than on shared attention. Even intelligence alone did not guarantee safety. Large brains consume enormous amounts of energy. The modern human brain uses roughly 20% of the body's energy, despite being only a small fraction of total body weight. In environments where food was uncertain, this became a serious evolutionary cost. Our ancestors were feeding an organ that constantly demanded calories while living in landscapes where starvation was common. From the beginning, the human species carried a difficult balance: a fragile body, dependent offspring, dangerous surroundings, and a brain expensive enough to become a liability if survival systems failed even briefly. One of the quietest dangers in human history was hidden inside the human body itself. Long before disease, predators, or famine threatened survival, evolution had already created a biological problem that made human life unusually fragile from the very beginning. The same large brain that would eventually allow humans to remember seasons, make tools, preserve stories, and imagine the future also made birth far more dangerous than it is for most mammals. In many animals, birth is relatively quick and instinctive. Among humans, it became one of the most physically risky moments of existence. The reason is connected to two evolutionary changes happening at the same time. Early humans gradually developed larger brains, while they also adapted to walking upright on two legs. Walking upright reshaped the pelvis over hundreds of thousands of years. The human pelvis became narrower and more structured for balance and movement. At the same time, infant skulls became larger to contain growing brains. These two trends slowly moved against each other. The result was a difficult compromise. Human babies had to pass through a birth canal that evolution had not fully optimized for increasingly large heads. Even in modern hospitals, childbirth still carries risk. In prehistoric environments without surgery, antibiotics, or blood transfusions, those risks were far greater. Anthropologists sometimes describe human birth as one of evolution's imperfect negotiations. The human body did not become ideally designed for either childbirth or upright walking. Instead, it became just effective enough for both to continue. This created a survival problem that affected the entire species. A mother weakened or injured during birth could struggle to gather food, travel, or protect children afterward. A child born too early might not survive. A child born too late in development could become impossible to deliver safely. Human evolution settled into a narrow biological balance between these dangers. Some scientists believe this is one reason human babies are born neurologically unfinished compared with many other mammals. A newborn human brain continues enormous development after birth, partly because staying longer inside the womb would make delivery even more dangerous. In a sense, humans enter the world earlier than many animals because the body cannot safely wait much longer. This helplessness shaped nearly every aspect of early human life. Human infants require years of care before they can survive independently. That meant pregnancy itself was not the end of the survival challenge. It was the beginning of a long period of vulnerability for both parent and child. In unstable climates where food could disappear seasonally, carrying and feeding dependent children demanded constant cooperation from groups. A solitary human mother in prehistoric conditions faced extraordinary risks. This may be one reason humans evolved unusually strong social attachment systems. Emotional bonding was not merely sentimental. It increased the chance that adults would continue protecting offspring despite exhaustion, hunger, or danger. Some evolutionary researchers believe even the human tendency toward empathy and caregiving may have been strengthened because offspring survival depended on prolonged cooperation. The cost of raising a human child was simply too high for indifference. Fossil evidence also suggests that some injured or disabled individuals survived longer than expected in early human groups, implying that others cared for them. This behavior was unusual in nature. Most wild animals cannot afford prolonged support for weak individuals. Early humans may have survived partly because they slowly became a species capable of carrying burdens together. Yet this dependence also created another fragile condition. If social bonds broke down, survival rates could collapse quickly. A group weakened by hunger, conflict, disease, or migration pressure might lose not only adults, but entire future generations. Human continuity depended on children surviving long enough to remember what older generations already knew. Without that transfer, knowledge disappeared almost immediately. Fire-making techniques, safe migration paths, edible plants, seasonal patterns, and protective behaviors all had to be relearned through painful experience. The large human brain eventually became our greatest advantage, but for a very long time, it may also have been one of the reasons human existence remained so uncertain. Evolution gave humans intelligence slowly, but demanded immense biological costs in return. Every newborn child carried both the possibility of future survival and the immediate danger of present loss. For most animals, survival begins almost immediately after birth. A young deer learns to stand within hours. Many birds begin testing their wings within weeks. Even predators born helpless often mature quickly because the natural world rarely allows long periods of dependence. Early humans followed a very different pattern. Human childhood became unusually long, slow, and demanding. In modern life, this can feel normal, but in prehistoric environments, it created one of the greatest survival burdens any species had ever carried. A human child required protection not for days or months, but for many years. During that time, the child consumed food, demanded attention, slowed migration, and remained vulnerable to injury, disease, weather, and predators. From an evolutionary perspective, this was a dangerous investment. Every child represented years of uncertainty before contributing back to the group. If food shortages arrived during that period, survival calculations became harsh very quickly. Anthropologists believe this prolonged childhood was closely connected to the growing complexity of the human brain. Humans were not simply learning movement or hunting instincts. They were slowly absorbing enormous amounts of social and environmental knowledge. Which plants caused illness, which animals migrated seasonally, which sounds in darkness signaled danger, where water could still be found during dry months. How to recognize changing weather patterns. Much of this information could not be inherited genetically fast enough. It had to be taught, remembered, repeated, and preserved through observation. A long childhood gave the brain time to build these systems. But it also meant the species became deeply dependent on stable, social structures. Unlike many animals, humans could not rely only on instinct to survive. Knowledge became part of survival itself. This created another unusual condition. The survival of a child depended not only on parents, but often on entire groups. Researchers studying hunter-gatherer societies have observed that grandparents, older siblings, and unrelated adults frequently help care for children. Some scientists believe humans evolved as cooperative breeders, meaning child survival depended on assistance from multiple individuals rather than a single parent alone. In difficult environments, this increased the chances that children would survive illness, injury, or periods of food scarcity. Yet it also meant that the collapse of social trust could become catastrophic. If a group fractured during migration, conflict, or environmental stress, the youngest members were often the least likely to survive. Human continuity, therefore, depended on something fragile and invisible, stable relationships over long periods of time. Early human groups were not only fighting nature, they were trying to maintain enough emotional cooperation to raise children successfully while surrounded by constant uncertainty. Even adolescence extended longer in humans than in many species. The human brain continues developing for many years, particularly regions associated with planning, judgment, and social understanding. This slow development may have helped humans become adaptable thinkers, but it delayed full independence. For much of human history, survival depended on older generations remaining alive long enough to transfer experience to younger ones. A skilled elder could remember migration routes, seasonal cycles, dangerous territories, or methods for finding food during droughts. When elders died suddenly, entire groups may have lost knowledge accumulated over decades. In this way, human memory became partly external. It existed not only inside individuals, but across generations. If enough connections disappeared at once, survival knowledge disappeared with them. This may be one reason human communities became emotionally attached to storytelling, ritual, and repeated behaviors. Repetition protected memory from being lost. Some researchers even believe that language itself became essential because survival information grew too complex to preserve silently. The longer human childhood became, the more necessary communication became as well. Yet every additional year of dependence increased biological risk. A species with slow-growing children, vulnerable mothers, aging elders, and fragile cooperation systems should not have been an obvious candidate for long-term dominance. By many measures, early humans resembled a species permanently balanced near instability. Their survival required too many conditions to remain functioning at the same time. Enough food, enough protection, enough memory, enough trust, enough adults surviving long enough for children to learn what danger looked like before meeting it alone. When early humans first began spreading across ancient African landscapes, they entered a world that was already occupied by creatures far more physically specialized for survival. The environment was not empty, peaceful, or waiting for human arrival. It was dense with competition, hunger, and predators that had evolved over millions of years to kill efficiently. Large cats moved silently through tall grass. Hyenas hunted in groups and could crush bone with extraordinary jaw strength. Crocodiles waited near water sources where thirsty animals gathered. Venomous snakes blended into dry terrain almost invisibly. Even herbivores could become deadly when threatened. For early humans, nearly every part of the landscape carried risk. Walking through open ground exposed the body. Sleeping without protection invited attack. Reaching water often meant approaching places where predators also waited. Modern humans rarely experience the constant awareness that survival once required. In prehistoric environments, attention itself became a form of defense. A single moment of distraction could end a life before language even had words to describe what happened. Fossil evidence suggests that early hominins were sometimes prey animals as much as hunters. Some ancient skulls contain marks believed to come from large birds of prey. Other remains show tooth patterns matching big cats or scavengers. Humans today often imagine their ancestors primarily as successful hunters, but for long periods they may have occupied a far more uncertain position in the food chain. Before advanced weapons, coordinated strategies, and controlled fire became widespread, many early humans likely survived by avoiding confrontation whenever possible. Caution may have preserved more human lives than aggression. This helps explain why humans evolved unusually sensitive threat detection systems. The human brain pays close attention to sudden movement, facial expressions, darkness, isolation, and unfamiliar sounds because ancient environments punished inattention harshly. Fear itself became adaptive. Individuals who reacted quickly to possible danger often survived longer than those who remained calm too easily. Even today, many human anxieties appear connected to ancient survival pressures. People often fear darkness, hidden movement, heights, isolation, or watching eyes more instinctively than modern statistical dangers. The nervous system still carries echoes of environments where hidden predators were real daily possibilities. Ancient Africa was also ecologically unstable in ways that added pressure to survival. Forests expanded and shrank across long climate cycles. Grasslands changed over time. Water sources shifted seasonally. Animals migrated unpredictably. Human groups could not rely on fixed environments remaining stable across generations. A location rich in food during one period might become barren during another. This instability rewarded adaptability rather than specialization. Some scientists believe one reason humans eventually succeeded was precisely because they were not biologically extreme. Humans could survive in varied conditions by changing behavior instead of depending entirely on physical traits. But this flexibility came with a cost. It required constant learning, memory, and cooperation. Animals with sharper claws or faster speed could survive alone more easily. Humans often could not. Small groups moving through dangerous landscapes depended heavily on communication and shared awareness. One person noticing distant movement or remembering a safer route could protect many others. The species survived partly by distributing perception across groups instead of relying on individual strength. Fire may also have gradually changed the balance between humans and predators. Evidence suggests controlled use of fire became increasingly important in human evolution, though the exact timeline remains debated among researchers. Fire provided warmth, light, protection, and eventually cooking. At night, flames may have created temporary zones where predators hesitated to approach. This mattered enormously because nighttime was one of the most dangerous periods for vulnerable humans. Darkness reduced visibility, while many predators remained highly effective hunters after sunset. A small fire may have represented far more than comfort. It may have been one of the first fragile boundaries humans created between themselves and the rest of the natural world. Yet even with fire, tools, and growing intelligence, survival remained uncertain. Early humans were entering ecosystems already perfected by older species. Lions did not need civilization to dominate their environment. Crocodiles had survived ancient extinctions long before humans existed. Hyenas possessed social hunting systems that were already highly effective. Compared with these animals, humans still appeared physically unfinished. The deeper mystery is not why early humans struggled. The deeper mystery is how a vulnerable species surrounded by stronger creatures managed to remain alive long enough for history itself to begin. The world surrounding early humans did not remain stable long enough for comfort. Climate shifted repeatedly across thousands of years, sometimes slowly, sometimes with changes sharp enough to transform entire regions within the span of human generations. Forests that once provided shade and edible plants could thin into open grasslands. Rivers could weaken or disappear during long dry periods. Rainfall patterns changed, temperatures rose and fell. Animal migrations moved with the environment, forcing human groups to move as well or risk starvation. Unlike modern societies protected by stored food, permanent shelter, and global trade networks, prehistoric humans lived close to environmental limits. Small changes in climate could produce enormous consequences. Survival often depended on recognizing these changes early enough to respond before resources vanished completely. Scientists studying ancient sediments, ice cores, pollen records, and fossil layers have found evidence that Africa experienced repeated cycles of environmental instability during important periods of human evolution. Some researchers even argue that human intelligence itself may have been shaped partly by unpredictable climates. Animals adapted to narrow conditions can thrive while environments remain stable, but they become vulnerable when conditions suddenly change. Humans survived differently. Instead of evolving thick fur for cold or extreme speed for hunting, humans increasingly relied on behavioral flexibility. They moved, experimented, remembered, communicated, and adapted socially. Yet this flexibility did not eliminate danger. It only allowed survival to continue under pressure. A prolonged drought could still destroy food sources faster than humans could relocate safely. Harsh weather could separate groups from one another. Children and elderly individuals were especially vulnerable during migration. Even finding water became uncertain in some periods. Modern people often experience climate as background conditions. Early humans experienced it as immediate biological pressure. Every season affected the body directly. Heat increased dehydration. Cold increased energy demands. Heavy rains could spread disease or make movement difficult. Dry seasons reduced edible plants and weakened prey animals. Human groups may have spent enormous amounts of mental energy simply monitoring environmental patterns closely enough to avoid catastrophe. Memory became essential because forgetting seasonal changes could become fatal. This may help explain why early humans gradually developed stronger abilities to anticipate the future. Predicting where herds would travel or when rains might return increased survival chances significantly. In unstable climates, intelligence was not abstract. It was practical and urgent. Some paleoanthropologists believe that repeated environmental instability fragmented early human populations into smaller, isolated groups. During wetter periods, groups could spread into wider territories. During droughts or colder phases, populations may have contracted into limited habitable regions where water and food remained available. These cycles may have repeatedly reduced human numbers, separated communities genetically, and forced migration into unfamiliar territory. In this sense, human history may have been shaped not by steady progress, but by repeated interruptions and recoveries. Entire branches of human populations may have disappeared during difficult environmental periods without leaving clear records behind. The farther back in time researchers look, the more incomplete the story becomes. There were likely many groups that survived briefly, adapted partially, and then vanished before passing on much of their lineage. Climate pressure also created psychological strain. Humans are deeply sensitive to uncertainty because uncertainty once threatened survival directly. A changing landscape meant that yesterday's knowledge could suddenly become unreliable. Water sources dried up. Animal behavior changed. Safe shelter became exposed. Human groups had to remain alert, not only to present danger, but to the possibility that familiar patterns could fail unexpectedly. Even now, people often feel stress when routines become unstable or environments unpredictable. The nervous system still reacts strongly to uncertainty because ancient humans lived through long periods when instability often preceded hunger, migration, illness, or death. The species learned to monitor change constantly because ignoring change carried heavy consequences. Over time, humans became increasingly skilled at adapting culturally faster than biology alone could adapt physically. Tools improved, fire use expanded, social coordination strengthened. But throughout most of prehistory, none of these solutions guaranteed safety for long. Climate continued changing regardless of human plans. Storms, droughts, and temperature shifts repeatedly reminded early humans that survival depended on forces far larger than themselves. The species that would eventually build cities and satellites first survived by learning how to endure environments that rarely stayed predictable for very long. For much of human history, hunger was not an emergency. It was a condition that returned again and again, quietly shaping the body, the brain, and daily decisions. Modern humans often experience hunger as a temporary interruption between meals, but early humans lived much closer to uncertainty. Food could not be guaranteed by schedules, agriculture, refrigeration, or stored supplies. Every day depended on whether plants could still be found, whether animals migrated nearby, whether weather allowed movement, and whether previous knowledge about the landscape remained reliable. Many prehistoric groups likely spent most waking hours searching for calories in one form or another. Survival was deeply connected to energy. Without enough calories, the human body weakens quickly. Muscles lose strength. Immune systems become less effective. Thinking becomes slower. Injuries heal poorly. Children grow more slowly. Pregnant women face higher risks. In environments where food shortages repeated seasonally, the entire species existed under constant biological pressure. Anthropologists studying surviving hunter-gatherer societies have found that food acquisition often requires large amounts of movement and cooperation with uncertain results. A hunting attempt could fail repeatedly. Gathered plants might disappear after environmental changes. Some days produced abundance while others produced almost nothing. Early humans had no guarantee that tomorrow's landscape would feed them better than today's. This unpredictability affected human behavior deeply. The brain evolved to pay close attention to food because missing opportunities carried serious consequences. Sweetness signaled calories. Fat signaled concentrated energy. Smells associated with food triggered powerful reactions because the body learned over evolutionary time that energy shortages were dangerous. Even modern cravings may partly reflect ancient conditions where high-calorie foods were rare and valuable rather than constantly available. Hunger also shaped social behavior. Sharing food became essential in many human groups because individual success varied too much to survive alone consistently. One day, a hunter might return empty-handed while another found success. Gathering conditions changed with seasons and geography. By sharing resources across groups, humans reduced the risk that temporary failure would immediately become fatal. Some researchers believe this cooperative food-sharing system became one of the foundations of human social life itself. The species survived partly because groups distributed risk collectively rather than forcing every individual to survive independently every day. Yet this system remained fragile. When environmental stress became severe enough, cooperation could weaken under pressure. Droughts, migration failures, injury, illness, or growing population demands could strain social bonds dangerously. Hunger changes behavior even in modern humans. Under prolonged scarcity, patience shortens, fear increases, and conflict becomes more likely. Early humans had to maintain cooperation despite living near these pressures regularly. This required emotional control and social trust strong enough to survive difficult periods together. The body itself carries signs of ancient food uncertainty. Humans store fat more efficiently than many animals because stored energy increased survival during lean periods. Metabolism adjusts during scarcity. The brain monitors energy availability constantly because the body evolved in environments where starvation was always possible. Some scientists argue that many modern health problems emerge, partly because bodies designed for unpredictable food access now exist in conditions of continuous abundance. The human system was built expecting instability, not permanent surplus. For early humans, eating was also dangerous in many ways modern people rarely consider. Some plants were toxic. Rotten food carried disease. Water contamination could spread illness quickly. Large prey animals could injure hunters fatally during attempts to kill them. Even scavenging carcasses left by predators exposed humans to attacks or infection. Every calorie often came with risk attached. The farther back human history extends, the more survival appears balanced on narrow margins. There were likely seasons when groups survived only by remembering obscure food sources, following animal patterns carefully, or enduring long periods of reduced nutrition. Children born during harsh environmental cycles may never have reached adulthood. Entire groups may have disappeared quietly during extended shortages without leaving visible traces behind. Hunger did not merely threaten human existence occasionally. It formed part of the background condition in which human evolution unfolded. The species that would eventually build agriculture first survived thousands of generations without knowing whether enough food would exist beyond the next migration, the next season, or even the next sunrise. For a long time, humans were not alone. The modern world can create the impression that our species was always the natural destination of evolution, as if intelligence steadily moved toward Homo sapiens and stopped there. But the fossil record tells a quieter and stranger story. Different kinds of humans once existed at the same time, walking across different parts of Earth together. Among the most well-known were the Neanderthals, a human species closely related to us that survived for hundreds of thousands of years before disappearing completely. Their existence changes the meaning of human survival. If another intelligent human species could vanish after enduring so long, then our own survival no longer appears guaranteed or inevitable. Neanderthals were not primitive creatures stumbling blindly through cold landscapes. Evidence suggests they were highly adapted humans capable of tool-making, coordinated hunting, social care, and environmental knowledge. They lived across Europe and parts of Western Asia through difficult climatic periods that would have been deadly for many species. Their bodies were strong and compact, suited for colder environments. They hunted large animals, controlled fire, and survived through repeated Ice Age conditions. Archaeological discoveries suggest they cared for injured individuals who survived long after serious wounds that would have been impossible to endure alone. Some sites indicate possible symbolic behavior, though researchers still debate exactly how similar Neanderthal culture was to that of early Homo sapiens. The deeper point is not whether Neanderthals were exactly like modern humans. The deeper point is that they were successful enough to survive for an immense span of time. By comparison, recorded human civilization occupies only a tiny fraction of that duration. For hundreds of thousands of years, Neanderthals endured changing climates, predators, food shortages, and environmental instability. If survival alone measured evolutionary success, they were already remarkable. Yet despite all of this, they disappeared. Modern genetic studies have shown that Neanderthals and Homo sapiens interacted closely enough to produce offspring. Many humans alive today still carry small percentages of Neanderthal DNA. This means the relationship between the two species was more complex than simple conflict. There were encounters, migrations, and shared histories, now mostly lost to time. At some point, however, Neanderthal populations declined and vanished. Scientists continue debating exactly why. Some researchers point to climate instability. Others emphasize smaller population sizes, reduced genetic diversity, disease exposure, or competition with expanding Homo sapiens groups. It is possible that no single catastrophe erased them. Extinction can happen slowly. A species may survive one difficult century after another until numbers become too small to recover. Birth rates fall, groups become isolated, knowledge disappears with elders, genetic problems accumulate. Eventually, the species fades from the world not through one dramatic event, but through gradual weakening across generations. This possibility carries an unsettling implication for modern humans. Intelligence alone does not guarantee permanence. Neanderthals were intelligent enough to survive harsh Ice Age environments for vast stretches of time, yet they still disappeared. Their extinction reminds us that being human-like is not the same as being evolutionarily protected. Nature does not preserve species because they are emotionally meaningful or cognitively advanced. Survival remains conditional. A changing climate, shrinking population, unstable food systems, or repeated environmental stress can slowly push even highly adaptable species toward disappearance. The existence of Neanderthals also changes how we think about human uniqueness. There was once more than one kind of human looking at the sky, raising children, protecting groups, and searching for food under dangerous conditions. Modern humans are not the beginning of the human story. We are what remains after much of that story has already vanished. Every extinct human species represents entire worlds of memory, perception, and daily life that no longer exist. Their languages are gone. Their fears are gone. Their routines disappeared so completely that only fragments of bone and stone tools remain. The survival of Homo sapiens begins to feel less like destiny and more like continuation after repeated loss. Long before modern civilization appeared, the human family tree had already been narrowing quietly, branch by branch, leaving fewer survivors behind with each passing age. Neanderthals were not the only other humans who disappeared. As scientific methods improved during the last few decades, researchers began uncovering evidence that the human story was far more crowded and fragmented than earlier generations imagined. Fossils discovered in caves, isolated islands, and remote regions revealed traces of human relatives whose lives ended long before recorded history began. Some are known only from a few bones or fragments of teeth. Others left behind almost no visible remains at all, surviving mostly as faint genetic echoes inside modern populations. The deeper scientists look into human origins, the less human history resembles a straight line. Instead, it begins to resemble a landscape filled with overlapping human groups appearing, adapting, migrating, and vanishing repeatedly across immense stretches of time. One of the most surprising discoveries involved the Denisovans, an ancient human population identified largely through genetic analysis rather than complete skeletons. In 2010, researchers studying a finger bone found in a cave in Siberia realized the DNA did not match either modern humans or Neanderthals. It belonged to another branch of humanity previously unknown. Very little physical evidence of Denisovans has been found compared with Neanderthals, yet their genetic influence remains visible today in some human populations, especially among people in parts of Asia and Oceania. This means Denisovans once interacted closely enough with Homo sapiens to leave biological traces that survived even after their own populations disappeared. Entire human groups may have existed for thousands of years and then vanished so completely that only fragments of DNA remain to suggest they were ever alive at all. Other discoveries complicated the story further. On the Indonesian island of Flores, scientists uncovered remains of a small-bodied human species now called Homo floresiensis. Sometimes nicknamed the hobbits because of their small size, these humans survived on an isolated island environment and appear to have used tools despite their unusual anatomy. On the Philippine island of Luzon, fossils revealed yet another human relative, Homo luzonensis, showing combinations of traits not fully matching other known human species. In South Africa, Homo naledi displayed another unexpected mixture of ancient and more modern characteristics. Each discovery expanded the possibility that human evolution was not simple progression, but a long coexistence of many different experiments in being human. Some groups adapted to islands, some adapted to cold environments, some survived in forests or mountainous regions. Most eventually disappeared. Scientists still debate many details about these species because evidence remains incomplete. Human evolution is difficult to reconstruct with certainty when only scattered bones, tools, or genetic fragments survive. Yet the broader pattern is becoming increasingly clear. Homo sapiens were not alone for most of their existence. Multiple human species shared Earth at overlapping times. They likely encountered similar dangers: predators, hunger, climate instability, disease, and shrinking populations. Some may have exchanged knowledge or genes. Others may have avoided each other entirely. But one by one, nearly all of them disappeared. This realization changes the emotional scale of human history. Modern humans often imagine extinction as something distant that happens to ancient animals like mammoths or dinosaurs. But extinction also happened to humans themselves. Entire forms of human life vanished while the planet continued normally afterward. Rivers still flowed, seasons still changed, forests still grew. The world did not pause when those human species disappeared. Nature rarely announces extinction dramatically while it is happening. A population simply becomes smaller, more isolated, and more fragile over time until recovery becomes impossible. The unsettling part is how incomplete our memory already is. There may have been many human groups that left no detectable trace at all. Small populations can disappear without preserving fossils, genetic influence, or durable artifacts. The farther researchers look back, the more silence appears between the fragments we have found. Human history may contain entire lost chapters that vanished before anyone could remember them. The existence of these forgotten humans weakens the comforting idea that survival naturally belonged to us. Homo sapiens survived while many close relatives did not, but the reasons remain only partially understood. Intelligence alone was not enough. Tool use alone was not enough. Social cooperation alone was not enough. Many human species possessed some of these traits and still disappeared. Our species remains not because extinction spared humans entirely, but because extinction spared only one surviving branch of a much larger and more fragile human family. When modern humans look backward through history, survival often feels natural in hindsight. Because Homo sapiens still exist, it becomes easy to imagine that our continuation was somehow expected. Yet the deeper the fossil record is studied, the more another possibility emerges. Extinction may not have been the rare failure of human species, it may have been the normal outcome. Survival may have been the exception. Most branches of the human family tree are already gone. Some disappeared recently enough that they may once have shared landscapes with our own ancestors. Others vanished so far in the past that only scattered fragments remain. The pattern repeats again and again. Emergence, adaptation, decline, disappearance. From this perspective, Homo sapiens do not stand at the center of a steady human ascent. We stand at the edge of a long sequence of losses. Evolution does not move toward permanence. Species survive only as long as conditions allow. A species can become highly adapted to one environment and still fail when climates shift, food systems weaken, populations fragment, or competition changes. Dinosaurs dominated Earth for millions of years before disappearing. Countless marine species flourished and vanished long before humans existed. Extinction is woven into the history of life itself. Human species were never outside that pattern. The uncomfortable possibility is that many extinct humans may once have felt as stable in their world as modern humans feel today. Neanderthals survived across enormous spans of time. Other human groups adapted to islands, forests, mountains, or cold climates, successfully enough to persist for generations beyond counting. Their daily lives probably felt ordinary to them. Children were raised, food was gathered, elders remembered migration routes and seasons, communities adapted as they always had. Yet slowly, something changed. Numbers declined, conditions shifted, isolation increased. Knowledge may have disappeared faster than it could be replaced. Eventually, entire forms of humanity faded without understanding they were approaching an ending. Extinction often happens gradually enough that those living through it cannot recognize the full scale of what is occurring. Some scientists believe small population size alone may have made many human species vulnerable even without sudden catastrophe. A population does not need to fall to zero immediately to become endangered. Once numbers become too low, new problems emerge. Genetic diversity decreases. Disease becomes more dangerous. Environmental disasters affect a larger percentage of the population at once. Social knowledge becomes easier to lose when fewer individuals carry it. One harsh winter, one prolonged drought, or one failed migration can have consequences that echo across generations. Recovery becomes harder each time numbers shrink. Eventually, the species reaches a point where survival depends on increasingly fragile luck. This possibility changes how Homo sapiens should be viewed within natural history. Our species survived not because extinction stopped happening, but because we remained alive through pressures that erased many close relatives. There is still no complete agreement about why Homo sapiens endured while others vanished. Some researchers point to larger social networks. Others emphasize flexible diets, symbolic communication, technological adaptation, or broader migration patterns. Perhaps several small advantages accumulated slowly over time, but even these explanations remain incomplete. Human survival may not have depended on one decisive superiority. It may have depended on surviving enough difficult periods without crossing irreversible thresholds. Sometimes history changes not through dramatic victories, but through avoiding collapse slightly longer than others. The psychological effect of this realization is strange. Modern civilization often encourages humans to think of themselves as separate from natural vulnerability, yet the existence of extinct human species suggests otherwise. We belong to a lineage repeatedly exposed to disappearance. The Earth has already witnessed many humans vanish forever. Entire minds, voices, memories, and emotional worlds disappeared while leaving almost nothing behind. Some extinct humans may have laughed, grieved, protected children, feared storms, and watched firelight at night much as we do now. Yet their continuity ended completely. The planet moved forward without them. In this sense, Homo sapiens may represent less a final achievement than a surviving remainder. We are not the first humans to believe in tomorrow. We are simply the humans whose tomorrows continued long enough to become recorded history. The silence surrounding extinct human species serves as a quiet reminder that existence itself has never been guaranteed, even for creatures intelligent enough to understand what losing it might mean. At several points in human history, the number of surviving humans may have fallen far lower than most people imagine. Today, there are billions of humans spread across nearly every environment on Earth, connected through cities, trade systems, and digital networks so vast they can feel permanent. But genetic evidence suggests that our species may once have passed through periods when the total breeding population was astonishingly small. Scientists refer to this kind of event as a genetic bottleneck. A bottleneck happens when a population shrinks so severely that only a limited number of individuals contribute genetically to future generations. Even after the population grows again, traces of that reduction can remain visible inside DNA thousands of years later. Modern humans show signs of relatively low genetic diversity compared with many other species. This has led researchers to investigate whether our ancestors once survived through extremely narrow periods where extinction came uncomfortably close. Exactly how small these populations became remains debated among scientists, and different studies propose different timelines and estimates. Some research suggests human ancestral populations may have dropped into the low thousands during difficult evolutionary periods. Other, more controversial studies propose even sharper declines at certain points far deeper in prehistory. Researchers continue examining fossil records, climate evidence, and genetic patterns to understand these possibilities more clearly. What matters most is not any single number, but the larger implication. There may have been times when humanity existed as scattered, vulnerable groups separated by enormous environmental pressures. The continuity of the species may have depended on surprisingly few survivors remaining alive long enough to rebuild populations afterward. Imagining such a world changes the scale of human history. Instead of vast civilizations or endless populations, there may once have been only isolated bands of humans moving cautiously across unstable landscapes, uncertain whether other groups still existed beyond the horizon. Small populations create fragile conditions. If only limited numbers of humans survive, every death matters more. A disease outbreak can remove a large percentage of the population quickly. Drought can separate groups from one another permanently. Genetic diversity decreases, which may increase vulnerability to illness or inherited problems over time. Social knowledge becomes easier to lose when fewer elders remain alive to preserve it. In a small population, survival depends not only on individuals enduring hardship, but on enough people remaining connected across generations to maintain continuity itself. Human existence may have balanced near these thresholds more than once. Some scientists believe climate instability played an important role in creating such bottlenecks. Long droughts, shifting ecosystems, volcanic events, or changing migration routes may have repeatedly reduced habitable territory available to human groups. As environments became harsher, populations may have fragmented into isolated pockets where water, food, and shelter still existed. These surviving groups may not have known how close the species had come to disappearance. To them, daily survival would still have consisted of familiar concerns: finding food, protecting children, avoiding predators, and enduring weather. Yet from a larger perspective, the future of humanity may have depended on whether enough of these scattered communities survived difficult centuries without vanishing entirely. Modern humans often think of extinction as a dramatic event, visible to everyone at once, but population collapse can occur quietly over long periods. Numbers shrink generation by generation, groups become isolated, birth rates weaken, migration becomes harder. Eventually, survival depends on increasingly fragile chains of continuity. A few successful births, a surviving water source, a remembered migration path, a season mild enough to endure. The farther population numbers fall, the more heavily chance begins influencing the future. A single storm, illness, or failed hunting season can affect the species disproportionately when so few individuals remain. This perspective also changes how humans think about ancestry. Every living person today descends from populations that survived those narrow periods successfully enough to continue forward. Entire human lineages disappeared while others endured. Most humans who ever lived left no surviving descendants at all. The existence of modern humanity reflects not only survival, but uninterrupted survival across immense spans of instability. Somewhere in deep prehistory, there may have been moments when the future of the entire species rested within groups small enough to fit around a few fires at night. They could not have known that billions of future humans depended on whether they survived another season. They were simply trying to remain alive in a world that had already erased many human relatives before them. Scientists still do not know exactly what pushed early human populations towards such dangerous reductions in number. The farther back researchers look into prehistory, the more incomplete the evidence becomes. Fossils are rare. Entire environments have disappeared. Ancient populations left behind only fragments of their existence. Yet several possible forces appear again and again in scientific discussions: climate instability, prolonged drought, volcanic events, disease, shrinking food systems, and the difficulties created by small, isolated populations themselves. What makes the question unsettling is that none of these forces needed to destroy humanity instantly. Human populations may have approached extinction slowly, through repeated pressure accumulating across generations until survival became increasingly fragile. One of the most discussed possibilities involves long periods of environmental change in Africa, where early Homo sapiens evolved. Climate records suggest that some regions experience severe fluctuations in rainfall and temperature over immense spans of time. Lakes expanded and vanished, grasslands shifted, forests contracted, animals migrated away from drying areas. Human groups dependent on local water and food sources may have been forced repeatedly into smaller habitable regions. During especially harsh periods, populations could become geographically isolated from one another for generations. Isolation creates many risks. Small groups carry less genetic diversity, fewer skilled adults, and reduced ability to recover from accidents or disease outbreaks. A group surviving near environmental limits can disappear entirely from one failed season. Some scientists believe humanity may have endured multiple such contractions rather than a single catastrophic bottleneck. Another possibility often discussed is the effect of major volcanic eruptions. One event frequently mentioned in scientific debate is the eruption of Mount Toba in present-day Indonesia around 74,000 years ago. Toba was one of the largest known volcanic eruptions in human prehistory. Some researchers propose that ash and atmospheric changes from the eruption may have contributed to global cooling severe enough to reduce human populations dramatically. This idea became widely known as the Toba catastrophe theory. However, the situation remains scientifically debated. Evidence does not fully support the idea that all human populations collapsed uniformly after the eruption, and some archaeological findings suggest humans survived in several regions more successfully than earlier theories assumed. Still, the discussion itself reveals something important. Scientists consider it plausible that natural events beyond human control may have repeatedly threatened the continuity of our species. Humans evolved in a world where environmental disasters could reshape survival conditions across continents. Disease may also have played a role, though ancient epidemics are difficult to trace directly in the distant fossil record. Small populations are often highly vulnerable to infectious disease because there are fewer individuals available to maintain recovery afterward. If environmental stress had already weakened nutrition and social stability, illness could spread more destructively through surviving groups. Early humans lacked medicine, sanitation systems, or scientific understanding of infection. A disease capable of reducing fertility or killing vulnerable individuals during difficult climate periods could have lasting effects across generations. Yet even without disaster, small populations face mathematical dangers over time. Genetic diversity naturally decreases when only limited numbers reproduce. Harmful mutations can accumulate more easily. Fertility problems may increase. Social networks become thinner. Knowledge becomes easier to lose. Human survival depended heavily on memory and cooperation, but both weaken when populations shrink too far. An elder dying unexpectedly in a small, isolated group could mean the permanent loss of critical environmental knowledge. A broken social connection between neighboring groups might eliminate opportunities for genetic exchange or resource sharing. Extinction does not always require one overwhelming event. Sometimes it emerges from many smaller vulnerabilities interacting together until recovery becomes unlikely. The uncertainty surrounding these ancient bottlenecks also reflects the limitations of human knowledge itself. Modern science can reconstruct astonishing details about the distant past, yet enormous gaps remain. Researchers continue revising timelines, debating interpretations, and discovering new evidence that changes earlier assumptions. Human history before writing is partly reconstructed through fragments: pollen trapped in sediment, stone tools buried underground, chemical traces inside caves, damaged bones preserved by chance. The picture remains incomplete. There may have been environmental crises or population collapses that left little surviving evidence behind. Entire chapters of human vulnerability may already be lost to time. What seems increasingly clear, however, is that humanity survived not through uninterrupted stability, but through repeated exposure to conditions capable of ending the species entirely. Our ancestors did not move steadily towards safety. They moved through long periods where survival remained uncertain enough that future humanity may have depended on relatively small groups enduring pressures they could barely understand while living through them. There may have been periods in human prehistory when the entire future of our species depended on only a few scattered groups remaining alive across vast and unstable landscapes. No cities existed. No written records preserved memory. No maps connected distant populations. The world was immense, silent, and dangerous, and small human communities may have survived without knowing whether others like them still existed anywhere beyond the horizon. Modern humans are surrounded constantly by evidence of other people. Roads, lights, voices, networks, buildings, and machines create the feeling that humanity is permanent and everywhere at once. Early humans lived inside the opposite condition. Isolation may have been common. Entire groups could disappear without any surviving community ever learning what happened to them. In such a world, extinction would not necessarily feel dramatic. It could happen quietly, one missing group at a time. Imagine a landscape after years of environmental stress. Water sources have become less reliable. Animal migrations no longer follow familiar paths. Food gathering takes longer each season. Children survive less often. Elders carry knowledge, but even they are uncertain whether old patterns still apply. A small group moves carefully between shrinking habitable regions, carrying memory more than possessions. They remember where edible plants once grew. They remember dangerous valleys and safer shelters. They remember seasons that no longer arrive in the same way. Every surviving adult becomes important because each person carries skills, relationships, and knowledge that cannot easily be replaced. If one experienced hunter dies, food gathering becomes harder. If one elder dies, migration knowledge may disappear. If several children fail to survive harsh seasons, the future population weakens before it can recover. Human continuity may once have depended on chains this fragile. Small populations also experience time differently. In large civilizations, societies can absorb failure more easily because millions of people share labor and memory. In tiny prehistoric groups, every event carries greater weight. Injury, illness, conflict, or infertility affect survival immediately. A broken bone may reduce the group's ability to travel. A drought may force migration into unfamiliar territory where predators, diseases, or rival groups create new dangers. A season of scarcity can weaken people enough that the next season becomes even harder to survive. Human existence under these conditions would have felt deeply uncertain, even without understanding genetics or extinction scientifically. Survival was visible day by day. Researchers studying small hunter-gatherer populations have observed how strongly cooperation affects resilience during difficult periods. Sharing food, protecting children collectively, caring for injured members, and maintaining social trust can increase survival chances significantly when resources fluctuate. But cooperation itself requires emotional stability and long-term relationships. Stress weakens both. Fear changes behavior. Hunger increases conflict risk. Isolation narrows opportunities for exchange between groups. Under severe environmental pressure, human populations may have approached dangerous thresholds, not because individuals lacked intelligence, but because maintaining stable cooperation became increasingly difficult. One quiet tragedy of human prehistory is that many extinct populations likely disappeared without witnesses. There were no historians recording final moments. No monuments remained. A small group weakened by drought or disease may simply have failed to produce another generation large enough to continue. Their knowledge vanished with them. Their stories ended without language ever preserving them permanently. Somewhere in prehistory, there were probably human voices that became the last speakers of entire traditions without realizing it. A final fire may have burned in places where no future humans ever returned. The earth would have remained silent afterward. Wind moving across grasslands, rain falling into empty valleys, predators continuing their lives unchanged. Nature rarely marks the disappearance of small populations in visible ways. The possibility that humanity survived through such narrow passages changes how modern existence appears. Every living person today descends from ancestors who remained alive through all of those unstable periods, successfully enough to continue the chain forward. The number of surviving humans may once have been small enough that losing only a few additional groups could have altered the entire future of the species. Modern civilization, languages, religions, science, memory, and identity may all depend on the fact that somewhere, in environments now mostly forgotten, enough frightened and exhausted humans survived long enough to raise children who survived after them. They did not know they were preserving humanity. They were simply trying to endure another season in a world where survival never seemed guaranteed for very long. For most of human history, the Earth was colder, harsher, and less stable than the modern world people know today. Vast periods of prehistory were shaped by ice ages, long stretches of time when enormous ice sheets expanded across large parts of the planet. These glacial periods did not create permanent frozen worlds everywhere, but they changed temperatures, rainfall patterns, sea levels, vegetation, and animal migrations across entire continents. Human populations were forced to adapt repeatedly to environments that could become unfamiliar within the span of many generations. Survival was not simply about enduring cold, it was about surviving constant environmental rearrangement. During colder phases, massive amounts of water became trapped inside glaciers. Sea levels dropped dramatically, exposing land bridges that no longer exist today. Regions once covered by forests transformed into open grasslands or dry tundra. In some places, habitable land shrank severely. In others, newly accessible routes allowed migration into unfamiliar territory. Human groups had to follow changing ecosystems carefully because food sources moved with the climate. Animals migrated toward regions where vegetation still survived. Water availability shifted. Shelter became harder to find in exposed landscapes. The map of survival itself kept changing. Scientists studying ancient climate records have found that ice ages were not completely steady periods of cold. Temperatures often fluctuated repeatedly. Some climate shifts happened gradually, while others appear to have occurred more abruptly. Human populations therefore faced not only difficult environments, but unpredictable ones. A migration route used successfully for generations could slowly become impossible. Familiar hunting grounds could lose animal populations. Regions that once supported life could become too dry, too cold, or too barren to sustain communities for long. Early humans could not stop these changes. They could only respond to them. This required extraordinary flexibility from populations that were already physically vulnerable. In colder environments, survival demanded more energy because the body burns additional calories to maintain heat. Food shortages, therefore, became even more dangerous during glacial periods. Clothing, shelter, fire, and social cooperation became increasingly important. Evidence suggests humans gradually developed more sophisticated tools, controlled fire more effectively, and adapted migration patterns to changing conditions. Yet even with these adaptations, many regions remained extremely difficult to inhabit safely. Winter darkness, Freezing temperatures and unstable food systems placed constant pressure on survival. Small failures could become fatal quickly. A weakened fire, damaged shelter, or failed hunt during severe cold could threaten entire groups. Ice ages also affected human movement across the planet. Lower sea levels occasionally opened pathways between regions that are now separated by water. Human migration into new continents may have depended partly on these temporary environmental conditions, but migration itself carried risk. Moving into unfamiliar territory meant encountering unknown predators, climates, diseases, and resource patterns. Human groups entering new regions could not know whether the land ahead would support survival long-term. Some migrations succeeded, others may have ended quietly in disappearance. The farther humans spread, the more they encountered environments unlike those where earlier generations evolved. This forced humans to rely increasingly on learning and cooperation rather than biological specialization alone. One reason ice ages matter so deeply in human history is that they repeatedly tested whether human adaptability was strong enough to survive changing worlds. Many species struggled when climates shifted rapidly. Some large animals disappeared entirely during or after glacial transitions. Human populations also experienced pressure, fragmentation, and decline. Yet small groups continued surviving in scattered habitable regions called refugia, places where conditions remained stable enough to support life, while surrounding areas became hostile. These refuges may have acted as temporary shelters for human continuity during severe environmental periods, but surviving inside such regions could also isolate populations from one another for long stretches of time. Isolation shaped genetics, culture, and vulnerability. Modern humans often imagine Earth as fundamentally stable beneath civilization, but prehistoric humans experienced something different. The ground beneath survival itself kept changing. Coastlines moved, rivers shifted, temperatures fluctuated across generations. Entire landscapes transformed slowly enough for people to witness change, yet quickly enough to threaten continuity. Ice ages were not merely background conditions in human evolution. They were repeated tests of whether small, vulnerable populations could continue adapting faster than the environment changed around them. The fact that humans remained alive through those cycles does not mean survival was secure. It may simply mean that enough groups endured each transformation without disappearing completely. Cold was not the only environmental force capable of threatening human survival. In many regions of prehistoric Earth, the greater danger may have been the slow disappearance of water. Long droughts could transform familiar landscapes into places where survival became increasingly uncertain. Lakes shrank, rivers weakened, vegetation thinned. Animals migrated away from drying regions, and humans often had little choice but to follow. For early human populations living close to environmental limits, drought did not simply mean discomfort. It could reorganize entire patterns of life. A landscape that supported human groups for generations might gradually stop providing enough food or fresh water to sustain them. Migration then became necessary, even when moving carried enormous risks. Climate researchers studying ancient sediment layers and fossil evidence have found repeated signs of major drying periods in Africa and other regions connected to human evolution. Some lakes expanded dramatically during wetter eras and nearly vanished during prolonged dry phases. Grasslands shifted, forest boundaries changed. These environmental changes may have repeatedly pushed human populations into smaller habitable zones where water remained accessible. Competition likely intensified in these regions because animals and human groups concentrated around the same shrinking resources. Water sources became places of both survival and danger. Predators gathered there. Rival groups may have encountered each other more often. Disease could spread more easily when populations clustered tightly around limited supplies. Drought, therefore, increased pressure not only on the body, but on social systems as well. Migration itself was exhausting and uncertain. Early humans had no maps showing safe routes ahead. A group leaving a drying region could not know whether another stable environment existed within reachable distance. Traveling required energy precisely when food and water were becoming harder to obtain. Children, elderly individuals, and injured people slowed movement while remaining highly vulnerable. Crossing unfamiliar territory also exposed groups to new climates, predators, diseases, and conflicts. Some migrations may have succeeded only because environmental conditions remained survivable just long enough for humans to adapt. Others likely failed completely. Archaeological evidence preserves successful migrations more clearly than vanished ones. Human history may contain countless journeys that ended quietly in disappearance without leaving recognizable traces behind. Drought also changes human psychology. The human brain evolved to monitor patterns closely because stable environmental rhythms once determined survival directly. Seasonal rains, plant cycles, animal migrations, and water availability formed invisible structures around daily life. When those patterns began failing repeatedly, uncertainty itself became a source of stress. Modern humans still react strongly to instability in food systems, water access, and environmental unpredictability because ancient survival depended on noticing such disruptions early. In prehistoric conditions, ignoring environmental warning signs could become fatal within a relatively short period. Researchers studying human adaptation often note that humans survived partly because they became behaviorally flexible rather than physically specialized. Humans could alter migration patterns, diets, social cooperation, and shelter strategies more rapidly than biological evolution alone could change bodies. Yet flexibility had limits. Human populations could adapt only if enough resources still existed somewhere within reach. A drought lasting too long or spreading across too wide an area could overwhelm even highly adaptable groups. Environmental collapse rarely needed to destroy everything at once. It only needed to reduce survival margins below what populations could sustain consistently. Some scientists believe repeated cycles of drought may even have influenced the development of human social intelligence. Groups surviving environmental stress needed cooperation strong enough to manage resource sharing, migration decisions, childcare, and conflict reduction during difficult periods. Individuals who could maintain trust, communication, and collective behavior under pressure may have increased group survival chances. In this way, environmental instability may have shaped not only where humans lived, but how humans related to one another emotionally and socially. The species survived not through strength alone, but through the ability to remain coordinated while moving through uncertain worlds. Yet every successful adaptation also reveals how close failure remained. A migration route remembered incorrectly could lead to death. A water source expected to exist might already be dry. A group weakened by starvation could lose too many members before reaching safer conditions. Long droughts likely pushed many populations toward dangerous thresholds repeatedly across prehistory. Some recovered, others vanished. The modern world often hides how dependent humans still are on stable environmental systems, but ancient droughts reveal a deeper truth about human existence. Civilization was built by a species whose survival once depended on whether enough rain returned before memory, strength, and cooperation began breaking apart under the pressure of scarcity. There were periods in human prehistory when entire regions of Earth became so hostile that long-term human survival there may have been nearly impossible. Modern humans often experience the planet through controlled environments, insulated homes, heated buildings, transportation systems, stored food, and medical protection. These systems create the feeling that humans can live almost anywhere. But for most of our existence, survival depended directly on whether the surrounding environment could support the fragile biological needs of the human body. When climates shifted too far beyond those limits, humans were forced to retreat, migrate, or disappear. Some regions became temporarily unlivable not because every living thing died instantly, but because the conditions required for sustained human continuity slowly broke apart. During severe glacial periods, large areas of northern Europe, Asia, and North America became extremely difficult environments for human populations. Expanding ice sheets transformed landscapes into cold, dry territories with limited vegetation and dangerous seasonal conditions. In some places, temperatures dropped enough to shorten growing seasons drastically and reduce the diversity of animals available for food. Wind patterns changed, water access shifted. Human groups entering or remaining in these regions needed extraordinary adaptation simply to survive winters repeatedly. Evidence suggests that during the harshest phases, some territories were abandoned entirely for long periods before humans later returned when climates became more stable again. Heat could also become dangerous beyond sustainable limits. Scientists studying ancient climate patterns have found evidence that certain tropical and subtropical regions periodically experienced extreme drying and temperature stress severe enough to threaten both animal and human survival. When water disappears and vegetation collapses, ecosystems lose the stability needed to support larger populations. Humans are especially vulnerable to dehydration because the brain and body depend heavily on temperature regulation and constant fluid balance. Unlike some desert-adapted animals, humans cannot survive long without reliable water access. In regions where drought persisted for generations, entire migration systems may have collapsed. Habitable zones shrank, forcing populations into smaller environmental refuges where resources remained available. Some coastlines also changed dramatically as ice ages advanced and retreated. Lower sea levels exposed land now hidden underwater, while later warming submerged regions humans may once have inhabited. Ancient campsites, migration routes, and settlements may now lie beneath oceans, erased physically from visible history. Human populations living near coastlines faced constantly shifting boundaries between land and sea. Rivers changed course, wetlands disappeared, new barriers emerged while older routes vanished. The geography humans depended on was not fixed. A familiar landscape could slowly become unrecognizable across generations. Volcanic activity added further instability in certain regions. Large eruptions could spread ash across enormous distances, damage plant life, alter temperatures temporarily, and disrupt food systems already operating close to survival limits. Even when eruptions did not directly destroy human populations, they could intensify environmental stress already present from climate instability or drought. Early humans had no understanding of geology or atmospheric systems. Environmental collapse would often have appeared unpredictable and uncontrollable. The world itself could seem to change without warning. One of the most important realities about prehistoric survival is that humans could not remain everywhere continuously. Populations expanded during favorable periods and contracted during harsh ones. Regions that once supported life became temporary dead zones for human habitation. Other areas became isolated refuges where survival remained possible while surrounding territories deteriorated. Human continuity, therefore, depended not on controlling the planet, but on finding narrow regions where conditions remained survivable long enough to endure larger environmental shifts. This constant movement shaped the species deeply. Humans became migrants partly because staying still was often more dangerous than moving, yet migration carried its own risks. Entering unfamiliar environments exposed populations to predators, new diseases, unstable weather, and competition with other humans. The species survived by repeatedly searching for temporary stability in a planet that rarely remained stable for long. Modern civilization can make Earth appear mapped, permanent, and secure, but ancient humans experienced something very different. Entire regions could become inaccessible within the memory of living generations. Survival was never evenly distributed across the planet. At times, the world narrowed into scattered pockets where humans could still find enough water, food, shelter, and cooperation to continue existing. Outside those fragile zones, vast territories may have become landscapes. Humans crossed only briefly, avoided entirely, or disappeared within forever. The history of humanity was not built in a stable home. It was built while moving through a world that repeatedly reduced the number of places where humans could remain alive at all. In the modern world, survival often depends on enormous systems too large for one person to notice fully. Electricity arrives through distant networks, food appears from global supply chains, water flows from hidden infrastructure beneath cities. Because these systems are vast and interconnected, small environmental differences can seem unimportant. But for most of human history, tiny advantages in the environment could determine whether entire populations survived or disappeared. A slightly warmer valley, a cave protected from wind, a river that continued flowing longer during drought, or a coastline with more stable food sources could become the difference between continuity and extinction. Human survival often depended not on perfect safety, but on finding conditions that were only slightly less dangerous than the surrounding world. During difficult climate periods, some regions acted as refuges where environmental conditions remained more stable than elsewhere. These refugia may have contained enough fresh water, edible plants, migratory animals, or shelter to support small populations while neighboring regions became increasingly hostile. Archaeologists and climate researchers believe such areas played an important role in preserving both animal and human populations during severe environmental shifts. Yet these safe regions were rarely abundant paradises. They were often narrow margins of survivability surrounded by growing instability. Human groups living there still faced hunger, disease, injury, and environmental pressure. The difference was simply that conditions remained survivable slightly longer than in other places. Sometimes, even geography itself created survival advantages. Mountain ranges could trap rainfall and preserve vegetation, while nearby plains dried out. Coastal regions could provide more reliable food through fishing and shellfish gathering when inland hunting became unpredictable. Caves offered protection from wind, rain, cold, and predators. A valley shielded from severe weather might support plant life unavailable elsewhere nearby. Early humans likely learned to recognize these environmental patterns slowly through observation and memory. Knowledge of where survival remained possible became one of the most valuable forms of information a group could possess. Forgetting or losing that knowledge could become fatal within a generation. This may be one reason storytelling, ritual, and oral memory became deeply important in human societies. In environments where maps did not exist, memory itself functioned as survival technology. Tiny biological advantages also mattered enormously. A slightly stronger immune response could help an individual survive illness long enough to reproduce. The ability to digest certain foods more efficiently during famine could improve survival chances during harsh seasons. Tolerance for cold, heat, altitude, or disease may have varied subtly between populations exposed to different conditions across long periods. Evolution rarely works by producing perfect solutions instantly. More often, small differences accumulate over generations because they improve survival only slightly. Yet when populations live close to environmental limits, even slight advantages can become decisive over time. Cooperation amplified these environmental advantages further. A small group capable of sharing food effectively during shortages might survive where another group fractured under stress. A community remembering hidden water sources or seasonal migration routes could outlast neighboring populations that lacked the same knowledge. Humans survived partly because information itself became adaptive. Unlike claws or fur, knowledge could spread socially within generations. A successful survival strategy discovered by one person could help many others remain alive if the group stayed connected long enough to preserve it. Researchers studying prehistoric humans often emphasize that survival did not require controlling nature completely. Humans rarely dominated their environments during most of prehistory. Instead, they searched constantly for narrow opportunities within changing systems larger than themselves. A coastline rich in shellfish during one climate phase might support population growth temporarily. A forest refuge might allow continuity during drought. A migration corridor exposed by lower sea levels during an ice age could open access to new territory where survival remained possible. Human history may have advanced partly through chains of temporary environmental luck, combined with enough intelligence and cooperation to use those opportunities before they disappeared again. This perspective changes how human success appears. Modern civilization often celebrates large achievements: agriculture, cities, technology, exploration. But before any of those existed, the species survived through much smaller margins. A protected shelter, a surviving spring of water, a remembered path through dangerous terrain, a season mild enough for children to live through winter. Humanity may have endured not because the world became safe, but because certain scattered places remained just survivable enough, for just long enough, that fragile populations could continue carrying memory forward into the next generation. The survival of our species may have depended many times on advantages so small that the people benefiting from them never realized how close the alternative truly was. If an early human had been forced to survive entirely alone in prehistoric environments, the chances of long-term survival would likely have been extremely low. One person alone struggles to remain awake while sleeping safely, defend against predators continuously, care for injuries, gather enough food consistently, protect children, remember migration routes, and endure illness at the same time. The human body simply does not possess enough natural advantages for isolated survival under harsh conditions over long periods. Yet humans did survive, and one reason may be more important than almost any physical trait: cooperation. Long before cities, governments, or written laws existed, humans were already depending on one another in ways that many other species could not. Physical strength mattered, but shared attention, memory, and coordination may have mattered even more. Compared with many animals, humans are physically moderate creatures. A lion can overpower a human easily. Wolves possess sharper senses. Chimpanzees are stronger relative to body size. Large birds of prey see movement from enormous distances. Humans lack claws, heavy fur, armored skin, or exceptional speed. Yet, humans developed another survival strategy. Instead of specializing physically in one environment, they specialized socially. A group of humans could divide responsibilities, share information, and coordinate behavior across time. One individual might remember where water was found during a previous drought. Another might recognize dangerous weather patterns. Someone else could remain awake, while others slept. Over generations, survival knowledge accumulated collectively rather than existing only inside isolated individuals. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies often observe how strongly survival depends on cooperation, even today. Food sharing reduces risk because hunting success varies unpredictably. Childcare distributed across families increases the survival chances of infants. Injured individuals sometimes survive because others support them through recovery periods. This is unusual in nature. Many animals cannot afford to care for weak or injured members for long because survival pressures remain too immediate. Humans appear to have evolved increasingly strong social systems, partly because individual vulnerability was so high. Cooperation was not simply morally valuable, it was biologically useful. A human group capable of maintaining trust during difficult conditions could survive challenges that might destroy isolated individuals or fractured communities. Language likely strengthened this advantage dramatically. Humans became able to communicate dangers, migration routes, seasonal patterns, hunting strategies, and social expectations in ways more detailed than simple instinctive signals. Information no longer disappeared entirely when one person died, provided enough others remembered it too. This transformed survival itself. Knowledge could accumulate gradually across generations. A child could inherit lessons learned long before their birth. Fire-making techniques, safe shelter locations, medicinal plants, and patterns of animal behavior became part of collective memory. Human intelligence, therefore, functions socially as much as individually. A person alone might know very little. A connected group could know enough to survive environments no single individual fully understood. Cooperation also affected emotional behavior. Humans evolved unusually strong responses to social rejection, isolation, and loneliness because separation from groups once carried real survival danger. Being excluded from a small prehistoric community may have drastically reduced survival chances. Even today, the human nervous system reacts intensely to social isolation, partly because ancient humans depended on belonging for protection, food sharing, and reproduction. Emotional attachment became linked to survival itself. Caring for others, maintaining relationships, and preserving trust were not abstract social preferences. They were adaptive behaviors shaped by environments where humans rarely survived completely alone. Yet cooperation remained fragile. Fear, hunger, stress, and scarcity could weaken trust quickly. A group surviving near environmental limits constantly balanced between solidarity and breakdown. During severe shortages, conflict may have increased. Groups may have competed for territory, water, or food. Social bonds required maintenance precisely because survival pressures threatened them regularly. The remarkable part of human history is not that conflict existed, but that cooperation endured strongly enough for large-scale continuity to emerge at all. Civilization itself would eventually grow from these older survival patterns: shared labor, stored memory, coordinated defense, and collective planning. But long before agriculture or cities, small human groups were already practicing forms of cooperation that allowed weak individuals to survive inside dangerous environments. The species that eventually altered the planet may first have survived simply because enough humans learned that staying connected increased the chances of seeing another sunrise. In a world filled with stronger animals and unstable climates, cooperation may have been the closest thing early humans ever had to a natural defense. Long before humans wrote books, built libraries, or recorded history, memory itself may have been one of the most important survival tools our species possessed. Early humans lived in environments where forgetting could become dangerous very quickly. A forgotten water source during drought could lead a group into dehydration. A forgotten migration pattern could mean missing seasonal animals needed for food. A forgotten poisonous plant could cause illness or death. In unstable prehistoric landscapes, survival depended not only on strength or intelligence, but on the ability to preserve useful knowledge across time. Human memory became more than personal recollection. It became part of the survival system of the species itself. Unlike many animals, Humans rely heavily on learned behavior rather than fixed instinct alone. Birds can often build nests without instruction. Deer know how to walk shortly after birth. Humans arrive in the world unusually unfinished. A child must learn where danger exists, which foods are safe, how weather changes across seasons, where shelter can be found, and how social relationships function. Much of this knowledge cannot be inherited genetically fast enough because environments themselves change too often. Instead, humans evolved the ability to transmit information socially. Parents, elders, and communities carried survival knowledge forward by teaching younger generations what previous generations had already learned through experience. This process may appear ordinary today, but across prehistoric times, it represented an extraordinary evolutionary advantage. Human beings could accumulate knowledge gradually, rather than beginning from nothing each generation. Storytelling likely emerged partly from this survival need. Modern people often think of stories mainly as entertainment, but in ancient environments, stories may have functioned as memory systems. Important information becomes easier to remember when attached to emotion, rhythm, repetition, imagery, and narrative. A story about a dangerous river, a failed migration, or an ancestor lost during drought could preserve practical lessons long after direct witnesses had died. Repeated oral traditions helped maintain continuity in societies without writing. Some anthropologists believe myths, rituals, and repeated cultural behaviors often carried hidden environmental knowledge shaped over generations. Even when details changed through retelling, the deeper purpose may have remained connected to survival. Certain places became associated with caution, certain seasons became linked to preparation, certain behaviors became warnings repeated often enough that children remembered them automatically as adults. Human memory, therefore, extended beyond individual brains into culture itself. Language strengthened this system enormously. Through language, humans could describe events not currently visible. Danger no longer needed to be physically present for people to prepare against it. An elder could warn children about predators rarely seen but still remembered. A group could discuss drought conditions before water sources fully disappeared. People could imagine future risks based on past experience. This ability changed survival fundamentally. Humans became capable of planning across time in increasingly sophisticated ways. They could coordinate movement, preserve collective knowledge, and anticipate environmental changes more effectively than species relying primarily on instinctive responses. Yet memory also remained fragile. In small populations, knowledge could disappear quickly when elders died unexpectedly or groups became isolated. A migration route remembered for generations could vanish if no survivors remained to teach it. Environmental instability made this especially dangerous because survival information needed constant updating as landscapes changed. Humans, therefore, developed strong habits of repetition. Rituals, songs, seasonal gatherings, and oral traditions repeated information across generations to reduce the chance of forgetting. Repetition protected continuity. Even today, many human cultures preserve memory through repeated storytelling because repetition strengthens recall more reliably than isolated facts alone. Emotional attachment also helped memory survive. Humans remember emotionally meaningful experiences more strongly because ancient environments rewarded remembering danger, loss, safety, and social relationships clearly. Fear, grief, wonder, and attachment became connected to learning itself. A frightening event near a river might help an entire group remember to avoid that place during certain seasons. A story about survival through hardship could strengthen cooperation during future crises. In this way, human emotions became woven into memory systems that improved long-term survival chances. The species that eventually created written history first survived by carrying invisible histories inside living minds. Before there were archives or monuments, there were only human voices repeating what must not be forgotten. Around ancient fires, in caves, across migrations, and through long, dangerous winters, memory moved from one generation to the next. Humanity may have survived not only because our ancestors learned important things, but because they learned how to keep remembering them long enough for others to survive afterward too. Among all the changes that shaped human survival, few were as important as the gradual control of fire. Long before metal tools, agriculture, or cities existed, small human groups learned not only to fear fire, but eventually to preserve it, carry it, and use it intentionally. The exact timeline remains debated among scientists because evidence from deep prehistory is difficult to interpret with certainty. Some archaeological sites suggest controlled fire use may reach back hundreds of thousands of years or more. What matters most is not a single date, but the transformation that followed. Fire changed the relationship between humans and the environment in ways few other discoveries ever could. Before fire, darkness belonged almost entirely to other creatures. Human eyesight weakened significantly at night compared with many predators. Large cats, hyenas, wolves, and other hunters moved more confidently after sunset while humans became vulnerable. Sleeping in darkness exposed small groups to attack from animals or rival humans. Fire created something extraordinary in this world: temporary safety. A controlled flame produced light, warmth, smoke, and movement that many predators avoided instinctively. Around a fire, humans could extend waking activity beyond sunset, remain more aware of danger, and reduce the fear associated with complete darkness. For fragile populations living among stronger predators, this mattered enormously. Fire may have been one of the first technologies that allowed humans to reshape their immediate environment instead of only reacting to it. Warmth itself became another major advantage. During cold climates and ice age conditions, maintaining body temperature required enormous amounts of energy. Without shelter or heat, cold exposure can weaken the body gradually through exhaustion, illness, and reduced mobility. Fire allowed humans to survive in environments that might otherwise have remained inaccessible. A small flame inside a protected shelter could mean the difference between enduring winter and dying from exposure. Human migration into colder regions may have depended heavily on increasing control over fire and shelter-building techniques. Cooking changed survival even more deeply. Raw food requires greater chewing effort and often provides fewer usable calories. Cooking softens food, kills many harmful microorganisms, and allows the body to absorb energy more efficiently from meat and plants. Some scientists believe cooking may even have influenced human biological evolution over long periods by reducing digestive demands and increasing the calories available to support larger brains. The human digestive system appears less specialized for processing large amounts of raw, tough vegetation compared with many primates. Cooking transformed food into something safer, softer, and more energy efficient. In environments where calories were uncertain, this improvement mattered tremendously. Fire also changed human social life. Once darkness became less dangerous around controlled flames, people could remain awake together for longer periods after sunset. Anthropologists have suggested that fireside gatherings may have strengthened communication, planning, teaching, and storytelling. Knowledge could be shared more consistently. Social bonds deepened through repeated nighttime interaction. Memory, ritual, and cooperation may all have expanded partly because fire created protected spaces where humans could exchange information safely during hours that previously belonged mostly to fear and vulnerability. Smoke from fire may even have helped reduce insects and some disease risks in certain environments. Yet fire remained dangerous too. Uncontrolled flames destroy shelter, vegetation, and life quickly. Early humans had to learn not only how to use fire, but how to maintain it carefully. Before reliable fire-starting methods became widespread, preserving an existing flame may have been extremely important. A group losing fire during cold or wet conditions could suddenly face serious danger again. Fire, therefore, became something that required constant attention, memory, and responsibility. In some ways, the control of fire reflected a larger pattern in human survival. Humans did not eliminate danger completely. They created fragile systems that reduce danger temporarily if maintained successfully. A fire protects only while someone keeps it alive. Looking back across prehistory, fire appears less like a simple tool and more like a turning point in the human relationship with nature. Predators still existed, hunger still existed, climate instability continued, but fire gave humans a small, controlled space within hostile environments where warmth, light, memory, and cooperation could persist a little longer. Around those flames, generation after generation survived nights that might otherwise have belonged entirely to the darkness surrounding them. Cooking may seem so ordinary today that it is difficult to imagine how deeply it changed human existence. Meals are prepared daily in nearly every society, often without much thought about what cooking actually means biologically. Yet for early humans, the ability to transform raw food with heat may have quietly reshaped the body, the brain, and the long-term survival chances of the species itself. Some scientists believe cooking was not simply a cultural development added onto human evolution. It may have become one of the forces that helped drive human evolution forward. Raw food is difficult and costly for the body to process. Tough meat requires long chewing and digestion. Many plants contain fibrous structures that limit how much energy humans can absorb from them directly. Some foods are dangerous or indigestible when uncooked. Cooking changes this. Heat softens tissues, breaks down structures inside food, reduces certain toxins, and makes calories more accessible. This means the body can gain more usable energy while spending less effort digesting. In prehistoric environments where food shortages were common, this mattered enormously. Survival often depended on energy balance. If a group could extract more calories from the same food sources, their chances of enduring cold, migration, illness, and reproduction improved. The human brain may have been especially connected to this change. The modern human brain consumes a remarkably large amount of energy relative to body size. Although the brain represents only a small percentage of total body mass, it requires a significant share of daily calories to function properly. Large brains are biologically expensive. Early humans could not sustain increasingly complex brains without reliable energy sources supporting them. Some evolutionary researchers propose that cooking helped solve part of this problem by increasing caloric efficiency. Cooked food may have provided enough additional usable energy to support the gradual expansion of brain development across long evolutionary periods. This idea remains scientifically debated in some details, but many researchers agree that cooking likely had profound biological consequences. Changes in the human body itself may reflect this transition. Compared with many other primates, humans possess smaller teeth, weaker jaw muscles, and shorter digestive systems, specialized less for processing raw fibrous vegetation continuously. Chimpanzees, for example, spend large portions of their day chewing tough plant material. Humans generally do not. Cooking reduced the need for constant heavy chewing and allowed diets to expand into foods that were easier to consume after heating. Over immense spans of time, bodies adapted to these new conditions. In this sense, humans may have evolved not only through natural environments, but through environments increasingly modified by their own behavior. Fire and cooking changed what kinds of bodies could survive successfully. Cooking also improved safety in ways early humans may not have fully understood scientifically, but experienced practically. Heat kills many parasites, bacteria, and harmful microorganisms present in food. In prehistoric conditions without medicine or sanitation, foodborne illness could become dangerous quickly. A group weakened by infection during migration or famine faced serious survival risks. Cooked food reduced some of these dangers and made certain resources more reliable. This expanded the range of edible foods humans could use during difficult environmental periods. Survival improved not because nature became safer, but because humans learned how to alter food before eating it. The social effects of cooking may have been equally important. Preparing food around controlled fires encouraged gathering, waiting, sharing, and coordinated activity. Meals became social events rather than purely individual feeding behavior. Anthropologists suggest that this may have strengthened communication and long-term cooperation within groups. Sharing cooked food required trust because preparing meals took time and energy. A fire attracting people together after dark created opportunities for teaching, storytelling, planning, and maintaining social bonds. The survival value of these interactions may have extended far beyond nutrition itself. Human communities became more interconnected, partly because fire allowed them to remain together safely for longer periods each day. Yet dependence on cooked food also increased vulnerability in certain ways. Once bodies adapted to softer, calorie-rich prepared foods, surviving entirely on raw diets may have become more difficult. Fire had to be maintained, knowledge had to be preserved. Social cooperation became increasingly important because cooking often worked best collectively. In this way, one survival advantage created new dependencies at the same time. Human evolution rarely removed fragility completely. It often replaced one vulnerability with another. Still, cooking may represent one of the quietest revolutions in human history. Not a sudden invention changing the world overnight, but a gradual transformation repeated beside countless ancient fires across generations, almost too many to imagine. Somewhere in those dimly lit shelters, humans slowly began feeding not only their bodies differently, but their future minds as well. Modern humans are surrounded by technologies so complex and widespread that they can feel permanent. Electricity flows continuously, machines communicate across oceans, information is stored in vast digital systems duplicated around the world. Yet the earliest human technologies were nothing like this. They were fragile, local, and deeply dependent on memory. A sharpened stone tool, a controlled fire, a method for preparing food, or a remembered migration route could improve survival significantly, but only as long as enough people remained alive to preserve and teach those skills. Early technology did not exist independently from human communities. If a small group disappeared, much of its knowledge could disappear with it. In this way, technological progress during prehistory was never guaranteed to move steadily forward. Skills could be lost as easily as they were gained. Stone tools provide some of the oldest surviving evidence of human technological behavior. Simple cutting tools appeared deep in the archaeological record, gradually becoming more refined over immense spans of time. But even these tools required knowledge: which stones fractured correctly, how to shape edges safely, how to repair damaged tools, and how to use them effectively for hunting, cutting, or protection. A stone tool was not valuable only because of the object itself. It was valuable because someone knew how to make it. That knowledge existed inside human minds before it existed anywhere else. In small prehistoric populations, this created vulnerability. If experienced toolmakers died without passing on their techniques, a community could lose important survival abilities within a generation. Fire created similar dependencies. Knowing how to maintain flames, protect embers during migration, or eventually start fires intentionally may have required repeated teaching and practice. During harsh climates, losing fire could expose groups to cold, predators, unsafe food, and darkness again. Fire was powerful, but only while humans successfully maintained the fragile systems surrounding it. A storm, accident, or migration failure could erase those advantages quickly. Early technologies, therefore, did not remove uncertainty from human life. They reduced uncertainty temporarily, while creating new forms of dependence at the same time. Archaeologists studying prehistoric populations have noticed something important about technological development. Progress was often uneven. Some innovations appeared, spread partially, then disappeared from certain regions for long periods before reappearing later. This suggests human history did not advance through constant, uninterrupted improvement. Environmental pressure, migration, isolation, population decline, or social disruption could interrupt technological continuity repeatedly. A small, isolated group struggling through drought or cold may not preserve every skill developed by earlier generations. Survival priorities changed under pressure. When populations shrink too far, maintaining complex knowledge becomes harder because fewer individuals carry specialized information. Human technology, therefore, depended heavily on stable social networks capable of preserving memory across time. Language likely strengthened technological survival enormously. Teaching someone how to shape tools, identify materials, prepare food safely, or navigate dangerous environments becomes far easier through detailed communication. Once humans could explain processes verbally, knowledge no longer depended entirely on imitation alone. Skills became more transferable across generations and between groups, yet language itself remained vulnerable to fragmentation in small, isolated populations. Entire traditions may have vanished when communities disappeared. Some human groups likely developed useful technologies that left little surviving evidence because the populations carrying them eventually died out. The archaeological record preserves only fragments of what once existed. Technology also changed human relationships with time. Animals largely survive through immediate behavior and instinctive responses. Humans increasingly survived by preparing in advance. Tools could be carried for future use. Firewood could be gathered before nightfall. Knowledge could be stored socially for coming seasons. Human survival became connected to anticipation. The species learned not only to respond to present conditions, but to prepare for future risks before they arrived fully. This shift may have altered human psychology deeply. Planning, teaching, and preserving memory became survival behaviors as important as hunting or gathering. Yet even the best prehistoric technologies remained fragile against large environmental changes. A sharpened spear could not stop a drought. Fire could not fully protect against collapsing ecosystems. Knowledge itself could disappear if populations became too scattered or weak. Human survival still balanced on unstable conditions despite technological advances. The remarkable part is not that early technologies solved every problem. They clearly did not. The remarkable part is that vulnerable human groups managed to preserve enough knowledge across enough generations that fragile improvements slowly accumulated rather than vanishing completely. Civilization itself may rest upon countless ancient moments where exhausted humans successfully remembered one more technique, protected one more fire, or taught one more child how to survive before the knowledge disappeared into silence forever. For most of human history, people survived by moving through landscapes that changed constantly. Small groups followed animal migrations, searched for seasonal plants, adapted to drought, and shifted territory when conditions became too unstable. This way of life was difficult and uncertain, but it also carried one important advantage: mobility. If a region became dangerous, humans could sometimes leave before complete collapse arrived. Then, slowly, something changed. In several parts of the world, humans began relying more heavily on agriculture. Instead of moving continuously in search of food, people started planting crops, storing harvests, and remaining in one place for longer periods. At first, this may have seemed like a solution to instability. Agriculture allowed larger populations to survive in concentrated areas. Food storage reduced some immediate risks of starvation. Villages expanded, permanent shelters appeared. Human life became more organized around seasons of planting and harvest rather than constant migration. Yet agriculture also created new vulnerabilities that earlier humans had rarely faced in the same way. Hunter-gatherer groups depended on varied food sources spread across environments. If one resource failed, another might still remain available somewhere else. Agricultural societies often became increasingly dependent on fewer crops grown in fixed locations. This created efficiency, but also fragility. A failed harvest could suddenly threaten entire communities because so many people depended on the same food systems at once. Drought, flooding, disease affecting crops, or changes in temperature could produce famine on a scale difficult for smaller mobile groups to experience previously. Agriculture, therefore, increased food production, but it also tied survival more tightly to environmental stability. Once humans settled permanently, leaving became harder too. Villages required labor to build and maintain. Stored food encouraged populations to stay even when conditions worsened. Fields could not simply migrate alongside changing climates. Human communities became rooted physically to particular regions. This allowed civilizations to grow, but it also meant environmental collapse could affect much larger populations simultaneously. A prolonged drought no longer threatened only a small moving group. It could destabilize entire agricultural societies dependent on rivers, rainfall patterns, and predictable seasons. Archaeologists studying ancient civilizations repeatedly find evidence of environmental stress linked to population decline, migration, or social collapse. Agriculture created abundance, but abundance itself introduced new forms of risk. Population growth became one of the largest changes agriculture produced. Farming could support far more people within smaller areas than hunting and gathering alone. Villages became towns. Towns became cities. Yet dense populations also increased vulnerability to disease. Infectious illnesses spread more easily when humans lived closely together alongside domesticated animals and stored food supplies. Earlier, human groups were smaller and more dispersed, which limited how rapidly some diseases could move through populations. Agricultural life changed this balance completely. Epidemics became more possible once humans concentrated in permanent settlements connected through trade and travel. The systems that supported civilization also created pathways for large-scale biological threats. Social inequality may have expanded as well. Mobile hunter-gatherer groups often carried fewer possessions because movement limited accumulation. Agriculture allowed food surpluses, stored wealth, territorial control, and eventually organized hierarchies. Some people gained greater access to resources, while others became dependent on systems controlled by larger social structures. Survival increasingly depended not only on nature, but on political stability, trade systems, labor organization, and cooperation between strangers living in dense communities. Human vulnerability, therefore, became more complicated. Environmental failure could now trigger economic failure, conflict, migration, and disease together at scales previously impossible. Yet despite these new dangers, agriculture spread widely because it also solved immediate survival problems effectively enough for populations to expand. More children could survive when food supplies remained stable. Communities could support specialists who preserved knowledge, built tools, and organized labor. Writing, architecture, trade, and eventually states emerged from these conditions. Civilization grew from agriculture, but civilization did not eliminate fragility. It reorganized fragility into larger, interconnected systems. A single failed season in prehistory might once have threatened dozens of humans. In agricultural societies, failed environmental systems could threaten millions. The deeper irony is that the very development often celebrated as humanity's great escape from uncertainty may also have tied human survival more closely than ever to stable climate, reliable water, predictable ecosystems, and social cooperation. Agriculture made humans stronger in many ways, but it also created a world where larger numbers of people depended on conditions remaining stable for longer than nature has always been willing to guarantee. As human societies became larger and more dependent on agriculture, they also became more vulnerable to environmental change occurring at scales difficult to control. A small hunter-gatherer group facing drought could sometimes migrate elsewhere. A large civilization built around farms, cities, irrigation systems, and trade networks could not move so easily. Entire populations became tied to rivers, seasonal rainfall, fertile soil, and predictable climates. When those systems remained stable, civilizations could flourish for centuries. But when environments changed faster than societies could adapt, even powerful civilizations sometimes weakened, fragmented, or disappeared. Archaeology repeatedly reveals this pattern across different regions and eras. Human societies often appeared strong shortly before environmental stress exposed how fragile their foundations had become. One example frequently studied by researchers involves ancient Mesopotamia, where some of the world's earliest large cities developed between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. These societies depended heavily on irrigation agriculture. Water allowed farming to support dense populations in otherwise difficult environments. Yet irrigation also created long-term problems. Over time, salts accumulated in soil, reducing fertility in some regions. Environmental pressure combined with political conflict and changing river conditions may have contributed to periods of instability and decline. The problem was not that humans lacked intelligence. The problem was that civilizations often became dependent on systems requiring constant environmental balance. Small disruptions could accumulate slowly until societies struggled to recover. Similar patterns appear elsewhere. The ancient Maya civilization in parts of Central America built impressive cities, calendars, architecture, and social systems over many centuries. Yet evidence suggests prolonged drought periods may have contributed to major societal stress during parts of Maya history. Researchers continue debating the exact causes of political collapse and population decline because no civilization fails for only one reason: conflict, resource pressure, leadership struggles, trade disruption, and environmental change often interact together. Still, climate instability appears repeatedly in the archaeological record surrounding periods of major transformation. Civilizations built during favorable environmental conditions sometimes struggled when those conditions shifted significantly. The same may be true for societies connected to the ancient Indus Valley, where urban systems once supported large populations through organized infrastructure and trade. Changes in river systems and regional climate patterns may have affected agricultural reliability over time, contributing to population movement and social reorganization. Again, the deeper lesson is not that environmental change alone instantly destroys civilizations. More often, environmental stress weakens systems gradually, while existing vulnerabilities become harder to manage. A society already dependent on stable harvests, trade routes, labor systems, and political coordination may struggle when multiple pressures arrive together. Humans can adapt remarkably well, but adaptation requires time, cooperation, and resources. Environmental changes that unfold faster than institutions can respond may expose weaknesses hidden during more stable periods. One reason civilization becomes vulnerable is specialization. As societies grow larger, individuals perform narrower roles. Farmers produce food, builders construct infrastructure, leaders organize administration, traders move goods across long distances. This creates efficiency, but also interdependence. A failure in one system can spread consequences widely. Crop failure affects trade. Trade disruption affects cities. Political instability weakens food distribution. Disease spreads more easily through dense populations already weakened by famine or migration. The complexity that allows civilizations to flourish can also make them harder to stabilize once disruptions begin multiplying together. Modern researchers studying past collapses often avoid describing them as sudden apocalyptic endings. Many ancient societies transformed gradually. Cities emptied slowly. Populations migrated. Political systems fragmented, while cultural traditions continued elsewhere in altered forms. Human continuity rarely ends completely. More often, systems become too strained to maintain their previous complexity. The important pattern is that civilizations repeatedly proved less permanent than they appeared during their periods of strength. Massive stone structures survived while the social systems that built them disappeared. Environmental stability may therefore be more important to civilization than civilizations themselves often recognize while functioning normally. The deeper irony is that human success increased dependence on conditions humans could never fully control. Agriculture required predictable seasons. Cities required reliable water. Trade required stability across long distances. Population growth required continuous food production. Civilization expanded because these systems worked together successfully for long periods. But nature does not promise permanent stability. Rivers change course. Rainfall patterns shift. Temperatures fluctuate. Ecosystems weaken. Human societies repeatedly discovered that surviving environmental change becomes harder once millions of lives depend on systems designed for older conditions that no longer exist. The history of civilization may therefore be partly the history of humans repeatedly building structures of stability inside a world that has never stopped changing underneath them. Modern humanity often feels separated from the vulnerabilities that shaped earlier civilizations. Lights turn on instantly. Food arrives from distant regions with little visible effort. Water flows through hidden infrastructure beneath cities. Most people no longer wake each morning wondering whether their community will survive the next season. Compared with prehistoric humans facing predators, drought, or freezing climates directly, modern civilization appears extraordinarily secure. Yet beneath this appearance of stability, human survival still depends on fragile systems that many people rarely notice unless something interrupts them. The scale of civilization has changed, but dependence has not disappeared. In many ways, modern societies rely on environmental and technological balance more heavily than any humans before them. Food systems provide one example. A large modern city often contains millions of people while producing very little of its own food locally. Survival depends on transportation networks, fuel systems, global agriculture, refrigeration, weather stability, labor coordination, and trade routes functioning continuously together. Most supermarkets hold only limited supplies relative to population size. Food appears abundant because replenishment happens constantly behind the scenes. Yet this abundance depends on systems so interconnected that disruptions in one region can affect distant populations rapidly. Droughts affecting crop production, transportation interruptions, conflict, disease outbreaks in livestock, or unstable energy supplies can all influence food security across enormous distances. Modern civilization solved many older survival problems, but often by creating larger systems requiring uninterrupted coordination. Water systems reveal similar dependence. Ancient humans searched directly for rivers, springs, and seasonal rainfall. Modern populations instead depend on reservoirs, pumps, purification systems, underground pipes, and electrical infrastructure operating continuously. Large cities can support millions of people only because these systems remain stable day after day. Most individuals no longer see the full complexity behind something as simple as turning a faucet. Yet if power fails, drought intensifies, infrastructure breaks, or contamination spreads, vulnerability reappears quickly. Human biology has not changed fundamentally. The body still depends on clean water as urgently as prehistoric humans did thousands of years ago. Technology changed how water is delivered, but not the underlying dependence itself. Energy systems create another layer of fragility. Modern societies rely heavily on electricity and fuel for heating, communication, transportation, medicine, food preservation, and economic activity. In earlier eras, survival often depended directly on local environmental knowledge. Today, survival increasingly depends on large technological systems operating correctly across continents. A single power outage can disrupt hospitals, transportation, communication, refrigeration, and water access simultaneously. Most of the time, these systems function so reliably that people stop noticing them entirely. Yet reliability can create psychological distance from dependence. Humans begin assuming stability is permanent because instability becomes rare in daily experience. Climate stability remains equally important. Agriculture still depends on rainfall patterns, temperature ranges, fertile soil, and predictable growing conditions, much as it did for ancient civilizations. Modern technology can reduce some environmental risks temporarily through irrigation, storage, transportation, and scientific forecasting, but it cannot eliminate environmental dependence completely. Floods, droughts, heat waves, storms, and changing ecosystems continue affecting human systems worldwide. The scale of civilization may even increase vulnerability because so many people depend on synchronized global systems functioning continuously without major interruption. Earlier, human groups were smaller and more mobile. Modern societies are larger, denser, and more interconnected than ever before. Psychological dependence has changed as well. Most humans today rely on specialized systems they do not personally understand in detail. Few individuals know how to grow enough food independently, purify water without infrastructure, generate electricity, manufacture medicine, or repair complex technological networks alone. Civilization functions because millions of strangers cooperate indirectly through institutions, industries, science, transportation, and communication. This coordination is extraordinarily powerful, but it also means survival depends heavily on social trust and system stability remaining intact. The modern world sometimes creates the impression that humanity escaped nature through technology, yet a deeper view suggests something more complicated. Humans did not stop depending on fragile systems. We expanded those systems until they became large enough to hide their fragility most of the time. Ancient humans relied on rainfall, fire, memory, and cooperation inside small groups. Modern humans rely on electricity, global trade, digital communication, industrial agriculture, and environmental stability across entire continents. The forms changed, but the underlying condition remained similar. Human existence still depends on networks that must continue functioning day after day to preserve the feeling of normal life. Looking back across prehistory and civilization together, one pattern appears repeatedly. Humans survive not because the world becomes fully safe, but but because enough systems remain stable long enough for continuity to continue. The unsettling possibility is that modern civilization may feel permanent, partly because its fragile foundations are functioning successfully at this particular moment, just as earlier societies once believed their own stability would continue too. Humans often prefer explanations that make survival feel deserved. It is comforting to believe that our species survived because intelligence, strength, or adaptability guaranteed success eventually. These qualities certainly mattered. Humans learned, cooperated, migrated, built tools, controlled fire, and adapted to changing environments with remarkable persistence. Yet, when scientists study the deep history of life, another uncomfortable reality appears repeatedly beside adaptation: chance. Survival may always have depended partly on luck. Not luck in a mystical sense, but in the simple reality that random events, timing, geography, and uncontrollable conditions can shape which populations continue and which disappear. Evolution does not reward species according to fairness or moral worth. Sometimes survival depends on being in the right place when conditions change, or avoiding disasters that other populations do not escape. The fossil record is filled with examples of species that thrived for immense spans of time before sudden environmental shifts erased them. Dinosaurs dominated Earth for millions of years, yet a catastrophic asteroid impact transformed global conditions rapidly enough that most species could not adapt in time. Small mammals survived partly because their size, diets, and behaviors happened to fit the altered environment better afterward. This does not mean mammals were universally superior beforehand. It means survival conditions changed unexpectedly. In many moments throughout natural history, continuity depended not only on capability, but on circumstance. Human evolution likely contained similar moments. A drought slightly less severe in one region could allow a small population to recover while neighboring groups disappeared. A migration route remaining open a little longer could permit survival into safer territory. A disease failing to spread into one isolated valley might preserve a lineage otherwise lost. These differences may appear minor when viewed individually, yet across generations they could shape the future of entire populations. Scientists studying genetic bottlenecks often note how small surviving groups can influence the future disproportionately, simply because they happen to remain alive while others vanished. Modern humanity descends not from every human population that existed, but from the lineages that continued successfully through repeated uncertainty. Many others did not. Timing itself matters enormously in survival. A population reaching a fertile region before environmental collapse elsewhere may expand successfully. Another, arriving slightly later, may find resources already exhausted. Climate fluctuations occurring gradually may allow adaptation, while faster changes overwhelm recovery. Even cooperation and intelligence depend partly on conditions favorable enough for those traits to remain effective. Human beings can solve problems remarkably well, but no species controls every variable shaping its environment. Earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, disease mutations, storms, drought cycles, and ecological shifts occur independently of human intention. Throughout prehistory, survival likely depended partly on avoiding combinations of bad events arriving simultaneously. Small populations are especially vulnerable because chance affects them more strongly. If a large civilization loses several thousand people during disaster, continuity may continue. If a tiny prehistoric group loses only a handful of adults during famine or disease, recovery may become impossible. Random accidents matter more when numbers are low. A failed hunt, an early winter, an infected wound, or a dry season lasting slightly longer than expected can alter survival dramatically. Humans survived many such periods not because chance disappeared, but because enough groups managed to endure despite uncertainty remaining constant. Even modern science recognizes contingency in human history. Researchers often debate why Homo sapiens survived while other human species vanished. Intelligence alone does not fully explain it, because Neanderthals and other human relatives also displayed complex behavior and adaptation. Population size, environmental flexibility, social networks, migration patterns, and technological differences all likely mattered. Yet many scientists acknowledge that some aspects of survival may never be explained completely through single decisive advantages. History is shaped partly by accumulation of small events interacting over long periods. Sometimes surviving one difficult century creates opportunities impossible for populations that disappeared slightly earlier. This perspective changes how modern humans view themselves. Civilization often encourages the belief that humanity stands outside the randomness affecting other life forms. Yet deep history suggests humans always remained vulnerable to forces larger than themselves. Our ancestors adapted brilliantly, but adaptation occurred inside environments they could never fully predict or control. The continuity of humanity may therefore represent not only intelligence and cooperation, but countless moments where conditions remained survivable just long enough. Somewhere in prehistory, a storm may have changed direction, a river may have continued flowing one more season, a migration may have begun early enough, a child may have survived illness long enough to later produce descendants. The future of the species may have depended many times on events so small and ordinary that nobody living through them realized how much rested quietly upon their outcome. Every human alive today descends from an unbroken chain of survivors stretching backward across immense spans of time. Parents survived long enough to raise children. Communities endured harsh seasons. Small populations continued through droughts, disease, migration, and environmental instability. Yet surrounding this surviving chain are countless others that ended completely. Most human lineages that ever existed no longer continue into the present. Entire branches of ancestry disappeared quietly across generations until no descendants remained alive to carry them forward. This happened so gradually and repeatedly that the people living through it likely never realized their line would someday end forever. To them, life probably felt ordinary while continuity was already weakening invisibly around them. In prehistoric times, many human groups were small and geographically isolated. A few families might live together for generations within particular valleys, coastlines, forests, or migration routes. Children were born, elders passed on memories, and daily survival continued through familiar rhythms. These groups almost certainly experienced attachment to place, routine, and identity much as humans do today. They may have believed their world would continue because it always had before, yet small populations carry hidden vulnerability. If too few children survive, if disease reduces fertility, if migration fails, or if environmental pressure intensifies gradually, continuity can weaken silently over time. A lineage does not need dramatic catastrophe to disappear. Sometimes it simply produces fewer surviving descendants each generation, until eventually none remain. Genetic studies reveal how much human ancestry has already vanished. Although billions of humans exist today, our genetic diversity suggests that many ancient populations contributed little or nothing to future generations. Entire communities disappeared without leaving strong genetic traces behind. Some human lineages ended because populations died out directly. Others may have been absorbed gradually into larger neighboring populations through intermarriage and migration until their distinct identity faded. Either way, the result was the same. Their independent continuity ended. The world moved forward carrying only fragments of what they once were. This process still occurs quietly even in modern times. family names disappear, languages vanish when final speakers die. Cultural traditions survive only while enough people continue practicing and remembering them. Human continuity has always depended on repeated transmission across generations. Once that chain breaks fully, recovery becomes impossible. The emotional difficulty is that extinction rarely announces itself clearly while it is happening. A parent raising children during environmental stress does not know whether their descendants will continue centuries later. A small group surviving drought may not realize their population has already become too isolated to recover long-term. Humans experience life locally and immediately. The larger patterns shaping future survival remain mostly invisible within daily existence. Ancient populations that eventually vanished likely still laughed, loved, argued, protected children, and prepared for tomorrow, because tomorrow usually arrives until suddenly, across generations, it stops arriving for that lineage entirely. Archaeology preserves fragments of these lost continuities: a discarded tool, a burial site, traces of ancient fires, fragments of bones carrying genetic memories of populations no longer alive. These remains remind modern humans that entire worlds of human experience have already disappeared before. Languages once spoken fluently now leave no sound behind. Stories repeated for generations vanished when the last people remembering them died. Knowledge of landscapes, seasons, migration paths, fears, and hopes disappeared with communities that once considered their existence normal and ongoing. The silence left behind by extinct populations is one of the quietest realities in human history. This perspective changes how survival itself appears. Modern humans often think in terms of humanity surviving collectively, but for most of history, survival operated through smaller, fragile continuities: families, clans, villages, languages, and regional populations. Many of those continuities ended despite feeling stable while they existed. The survival of Homo sapiens as a species does not mean most human lineages survived successfully. On the contrary, disappearance may have been more common than continuity across deep time. Every person alive today represents one surviving branch among countless others already lost. Somewhere in the past, there were humans who expected future generations to remember them, just as people do now. Instead, their names, voices, and descendants disappeared so completely that modern science can recover only faint traces that they were ever here at all. The survival of our own lineage may therefore feel less like evidence of permanence and more like temporary continuation inside a history where many human futures have already quietly ended before. Human beings adapt to stability surprisingly quickly. When food arrives regularly, when cities function normally, when seasons remain predictable, and when daily life continues without major disruption, the mind gradually begins treating these conditions as natural and permanent. This psychological habit may have helped humans reduce constant fear and focus on ordinary life, but it also creates blindness. People often assume the systems surrounding them will continue because those systems have existed throughout their personal memory. Yet history repeatedly shows that stability is rarely permanent across long periods of time. Many human societies once believed their world would continue indefinitely, just as modern civilization often does now. The difficulty is not that humans ignore danger completely. The difficulty is that long periods of successful continuity make fragility harder to feel emotionally. Ancient civilizations likely experienced this same illusion. A city existing for centuries can appear eternal to the people living inside it. Children grow up surrounded by walls, roads, temples, markets, farms, and social institutions already functioning before their birth. Stability becomes invisible because it forms the background of ordinary existence. Few people wake each morning imagining that familiar systems might gradually weaken over generations. Yet archaeological history reveals countless places where complex societies once thrived before environmental stress, conflict, disease, or economic instability slowly transformed them into ruins. At the height of their stability, those societies probably felt as permanent as modern civilization often feels today. The human mind struggles to imagine large-scale change while daily routines continue normally. Part of this comes from how memory works. Individuals experience only limited spans of time directly. Even an elderly person witnesses only a small fragment of long-term history. Human psychology therefore relies heavily on recent experience when judging what feels stable or likely to continue. If seasons have remained predictable throughout one lifetime, people may assume they always will. If infrastructure functions consistently for decades, dependence becomes less visible. Modern civilization amplifies this effect because technological systems hide many of the processes supporting survival. Food appears in stores without visible farms nearby. Water flows from hidden networks underground. Electricity arrives through distant infrastructure few people fully understand. Stability feels automatic precisely because the systems are functioning successfully. Yet beneath this apparent permanence, many conditions remain delicate. Climate patterns still influence agriculture. Energy systems still require constant maintenance. Supply chains still depend on transportation, cooperation, and political stability across enormous distances. Human bodies still depend on clean air, water, food, sleep, and social order just as they always did. Technology changed the scale of survival systems, but not the fundamental reality that survival remains conditional. The modern world sometimes creates psychological distance between humans and dependence itself. People stop noticing how many invisible systems must continue operating together for ordinary life to feel normal. History suggests this invisibility can become dangerous because societies often recognize fragility clearly only after disruption begins. Environmental changes provide one example. Human civilizations developed during relatively stable climate periods compared with some earlier phases of Earth's history. Agriculture, cities, and population growth all benefited from conditions stable enough to support long-term planning, yet Earth's climate has never remained completely fixed across deep time. Rivers shift, rainfall changes, ecosystems reorganize. Temperatures fluctuate gradually or sometimes unexpectedly. Modern humans possess scientific understanding and technology far beyond anything available to ancient civilizations, but adaptation still requires time, coordination, and resources. Stability remains something maintained continuously, not something guaranteed permanently. The deeper irony is that successful civilizations may become psychologically vulnerable precisely because they succeed for so long. Comfort reduces awareness of dependence. Predictability weakens imagination about instability. People born into functioning systems naturally experience them as normal rather than temporary. Yet from a longer historical perspective, every civilization, language, political system, and technological structure emerged under specific conditions that could eventually change again. This does not mean collapse is inevitable or immediate. Human societies remain highly adaptable. The point is quieter than that. Permanence is often a feeling produced by continuity across short human lifetimes, not a law protecting civilizations forever. Looking back across prehistory, extinct populations, environmental shifts, and vanished societies, one pattern becomes difficult to ignore. Humans repeatedly mistake temporary stability for something more durable than it truly is. Perhaps this happens because the mind needs some sense of continuity to live peacefully at all. Yet the deeper history of our species suggests that survival has always depended on conditions remaining balanced, just long enough for one more generation to continue forward. The modern world may feel solid partly because, for now, enough invisible systems are still holding together around us at the same time. Modern humans often speak about the future of humanity as though continued survival is expected. People plan decades ahead. Nations design projects lasting generations. Economies assume long-term growth. Individuals imagine descendants living in worlds that will still contain cities, languages, institutions, and recognizable societies. This confidence is understandable because most humans alive today have experienced remarkable continuity compared with many earlier periods of history. Civilization appears technologically powerful. Medicine extends life. Global communication connects continents instantly. Scientific knowledge allows humans to predict and control parts of the environment more effectively than ever before. Yet beneath this confidence remains a quieter reality. The long-term survival of humanity is not guaranteed simply because humanity has survived until now. The emotional assumption of permanence may be far stronger than the actual certainty supporting it. For most of natural history, species disappeared eventually. Some survived millions of years before vanishing. Others existed briefly. Extinction is not unusual in Earth's history. It is the common outcome. The species alive today represent only a small fraction of all species that once existed. Humans often view themselves differently because intelligence allows reflection, planning, and technological adaptation. These abilities certainly improve survival chances, but they do not remove vulnerability completely. Humans still depend on biological systems, environmental stability, cooperation, and functioning infrastructure. A species capable of building satellites and cities remains vulnerable to disease, climate instability, ecological collapse, conflict, and resource disruption. Technology changes the scale of adaptation, but not the existence of limits themselves. One reason modern humans may underestimate fragility is that civilization has grown during an unusually stable climatic period relative to much of earlier Earth history. Agriculture expanded under conditions stable enough for long-term farming. Coastlines remained predictable enough for cities and trade networks to develop. Population growth accelerated because environmental systems supported continuous expansion. Humans adapted psychologically to this stability. Generations were born into worlds where food systems, infrastructure, and governments usually continued functioning despite occasional crises. Over time, continuity began feeling normal rather than conditional. Yet deep history suggests stability itself is often temporary across longer timescales. Human civilization also depends heavily on interconnected systems that can amplify disruption. In earlier eras, isolated populations sometimes survived because collapse remained localized. Modern civilization links food production, energy, medicine, communication, transportation, and finance across global networks. This interdependence creates enormous efficiency, but also systemic vulnerability. Problems in one region can spread consequences rapidly elsewhere. Ecological damage, pandemics, large-scale conflict, or major environmental shifts now interact inside densely connected systems, supporting billions of people simultaneously. Human survival remains possible under many difficult conditions, but maintaining complex civilization requires stability across multiple systems at once. The distinction between species survival and civilization survival matters too. Homo sapiens might continue existing biologically even after severe societal collapse, just as humans survived many prehistoric crises before civilization emerged. But the continuity people emotionally imagine usually includes more than biology alone. People expect future generations to inherit knowledge, institutions, cities, medicine, science, and culture continuously. History suggests these systems are less permanent than they appear during stable periods. Civilizations transform, languages disappear, technologies are forgotten, political systems collapse. Human continuity often survives through change rather than preservation of existing structures exactly as they are. Psychological distance from extinction also shapes human thinking. Most individuals experience life through personal timescales measured in years or decades. Extinction unfolds across longer spans, difficult for the mind to feel emotionally. A person may intellectually understand that civilizations are fragile while still emotionally assuming tomorrow will resemble yesterday closely enough for ordinary life to continue. This tension between intellectual awareness and emotional expectation may be deeply human. Survival requires enough confidence to continue building futures, even in worlds where certainty never fully exists. Scientists studying existential risks today sometimes discuss threats capable of affecting humanity globally: nuclear war, severe climate disruption, engineered pandemics, ecological collapse, or other large-scale systemic failures. These discussions are often uncomfortable because they challenge the assumption that intelligence automatically guarantees indefinite survival. Yet acknowledging vulnerability does not mean predicting inevitable catastrophe. It means recognizing that survival has always required ongoing adaptation rather than permanent safety. Looking back across all the narrow passages, humanity already survived droughts, ice ages, bottlenecks, migrations, collapsing ecosystems, disease, and fragile civilizations. One realization becomes difficult to ignore: humans are not separate from the conditions shaping other life forms on Earth. We remain part of a larger natural history where continuity is never fully guaranteed. The remarkable fact is not that humanity is certainly permanent. The remarkable fact is that a vulnerable species survived long enough to begin imagining permanence at all. When people look back at human history, it is tempting to describe humanity as a species that conquered the planet through superiority and dominance. Modern civilization covers vast landscapes with cities, roads, machines, and networks visible even from space. Humans altered rivers, transformed ecosystems, crossed oceans, and built technologies earlier generations could barely imagine. From this perspective, survival can appear inevitable, as though humans were always destined to become the dominant species on Earth. Yet the deeper history of humanity suggests something quieter and perhaps more truthful. Humans did not survive because they were invulnerable. They survived because they remained adaptable while repeatedly confronting their own fragility. Again and again, human continuity depended less on absolute control and more on recognizing danger early enough to respond before collapse became irreversible. Adaptability shaped nearly every stage of human survival. Early humans migrated when climates shifted. They changed diets when ecosystems transformed. They learned new hunting methods, new shelter strategies, and new forms of cooperation depending on local conditions. Unlike highly specialized species adapted narrowly to one environment, humans survived partly because behavior could change faster than biology alone. Knowledge accumulated socially, techniques improved gradually. Communities adjusted migration routes, food preparation, clothing, and social structures over time. This flexibility allowed humans to endure environments ranging from cold, northern regions to dry grasslands and coastal ecosystems. Yet adaptation succeeded only because humans remained sensitive to instability around them. Awareness of fragility may therefore have been one of the species' greatest strengths. Prehistoric humans could not afford the illusion that survival was guaranteed. Hunger, weather, predators, disease, and injury remained visible realities within daily life. A failed season carried immediate consequences. Water shortages could not be ignored. Weak social bonds endangered group survival directly. Ancient humans lived close enough to environmental pressure that the connection between survival and adaptation remained constantly visible. Modern civilization sometimes hides this relationship because large systems absorb many disruptions before individuals notice them personally. Yet the underlying reality remains similar. Survival still depends on noticing changing conditions before systems fail completely. Cooperation also reflects this pattern. Human communities survived not because individuals became completely independent, but because interdependence increased resilience. Sharing food reduced risk during scarcity. Collective memory preserved survival knowledge. Caring for children and injured members strengthened continuity across generations. Social trust allowed coordination larger than any isolated person could achieve alone. Humans became powerful partly because vulnerability encouraged cooperation. A species less fragile, individually, might never have needed such deep social dependence. In this sense, weakness itself shaped the strengths that later allowed civilization to emerge. Humility toward nature may have played an important role too, even before humans understood science formally. Early humans could not control droughts, ice ages, storms, disease, or ecosystem collapse completely. They survived by responding to changing realities rather than assuming nature would obey human expectation. Migration occurred because environments changed. Food systems shifted because conditions demanded adaptation. Human continuity depended on flexibility more than certainty. The danger in modern times may not come only from external threats, but from forgetting this older relationship between survival and fragility. Civilizations functioning successfully for long periods can begin assuming stability is permanent. Technological power can create the impression that humans stand outside natural limits entirely. Yet history repeatedly shows that societies remain dependent on environmental balance, cooperation, and the ability to adapt when conditions change unexpectedly. Awareness of fragility is not pessimism. In many ways, it may be one of the most realistic forms of wisdom humans developed across prehistory. Species survive longer when they remain responsive to warning signs rather than assuming invulnerability. Individuals and civilizations alike become more resilient when they recognize dependence clearly instead of hiding from it emotionally. The remarkable story of humanity may therefore be less about domination than about persistence. Small, vulnerable populations survived repeated instability, not because they controlled the world fully, but because they adjusted continuously inside worlds they could never fully control. Looking across the long arc of human existence, the lesson appears surprisingly calm. Humanity endured through cooperation, memory, flexibility, and awareness that survival could never be taken completely for granted. Perhaps the future of the species will depend on whether modern humans can still remember those older instincts beneath the confidence of civilization. The same fragile species that once gathered around fires during cold, uncertain nights is still here, still adapting, and still living inside a world capable of changing faster than certainty ever can. For hundreds of thousands of years, human existence moved through conditions that often should have ended it. Small populations crossed unstable climates without maps. Groups survived droughts without knowing when rain would return. Families endured freezing nights beside fragile fires that could disappear with a single storm. Entire communities carried memory only through spoken words, vulnerable to being lost forever if too many people died at once. Human beings lived through bottlenecks, migrations, disease, environmental collapse, and the silent disappearance of countless other lineages that once walked the earth beside them. Again and again, survival balanced on narrow margins, so fragile that modern people can barely imagine living under such uncertainty continuously. Yet somehow, enough humans remained alive long enough for the story to continue. Every city, language, book, and human face existing today emerge from that long chain of improbable continuity. Looking back across this history creates a strange feeling. Humanity appears both powerful and fragile at the same time. Powerful because humans adapted to environments ranging from cold tundra to dry grasslands, crossed oceans, created agriculture, built civilizations, and learned to preserve knowledge across generations. Fragile because none of this was guaranteed. Many populations disappeared completely. Entire human worlds ended without leaving more than scattered traces behind. Stability arrived temporarily, then changed again. Survival was never permanent victory over nature. It was ongoing adjustment within conditions that could always shift unexpectedly. Perhaps this is one of the quietest truths hidden beneath civilization. Humans often imagine history as a steady movement upward toward greater control and certainty, but deep time suggests something more delicate. The species survived partly because each generation inherited enough knowledge, cooperation, adaptability, and luck to continue a little farther forward than the generation before. Continuity did not come from perfect safety, it came from repeated recovery. Again and again, humans endured conditions that could have erased them, then continued carrying memory into the future despite uncertainty remaining unresolved. There is also something deeply humbling in realizing how many people lived ordinary lives without knowing how close their existence stood to disappearance. Ancient humans gathering around fires during cold seasons did not know their descendants would one day build modern civilization. Parents protecting children during drought did not know whether humanity would continue for another 1,000 years, much less hundreds of thousands. Most people throughout history lived without certainty that the systems surrounding them would survive permanently. They simply continued caring for one another, preserving memory, adapting to change, and moving forward because life always unfolds one day at a time, even inside unstable worlds. Modern humans still live inside this same larger reality, although technology often softens its visibility. The future remains open. Scientific knowledge allows humanity to understand many dangers more clearly than any earlier civilization could. Medicine, communication, and global cooperation create possibilities earlier humans never possessed. Yet the future still depends on choices, environments, relationships, and systems that remain imperfect and vulnerable. No generation receives a guarantee that continuity will continue automatically forever. Every civilization in history once believed its world would remain stable longer than it ultimately did. Perhaps wisdom begins not by fearing this uncertainty constantly, but by recognizing it honestly. Awareness of fragility can deepen appreciation for survival itself. The existence of humanity is not ordinary when viewed against the vast history of life on Earth. Countless species disappeared, countless human stories ended without descendants. Yet somehow, through immense stretches of danger and instability, consciousness continued. Human voices continued, memory continued. Fires remained lit long enough for another generation to survive and ask questions about where they came from. Maybe that is part of the educational meaning hidden inside the history of human survival. Civilization is not proof that humans escaped nature forever. It is evidence that cooperation, memory, adaptability, and care allowed a vulnerable species to continue much longer than circumstances often seem to allow. The future may depend on whether humanity remembers this truth clearly enough to remain cautious, connected, and adaptable in the centuries ahead. Tonight, somewhere on Earth, billions of people sleep believing humanity will still exist tomorrow morning. Across most of history, our ancestors hoped for the same thing without ever knowing the answer with certainty. And perhaps the deepest question is not whether humans once almost disappeared, but whether any civilization can ever truly know how close it always stands to the edge until long after the danger has already passed.